The golden sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the university library, casting a warm glow over the endless rows of knowledge. 19-year-old Exoyu was in her element, her fingers dancing across the spines of ancient texts as she hunted for the perfect source for her thesis. She was just an ordinary college student with a passion for history that bordered on obsession, her emerald eyes sparkling with delight every time she uncovered a hidden gem from the past. Suddenly, her phone erupted with a barrage of notifications, the screen buzzing incessantly with messages from her friends. They were all eager to hit the SKP mall for the latest lipstick shades and bubble tea. But Soyu couldn't be swayed. With a small, determined smile, she tapped out a quick refusal. Her thesis wasn't going to write itself, and the library was her true sanctuary. Her friends playfully lamented her status as a total bookworm, but she didn't mind the teasing. Reading was her escape, a way to dive into different realms and eras. Even if she occasionally lost track of time, ended up elbow-deep in a book that had absolutely nothing to do with her research. She chided herself for her lack of focus, knowing she couldn't stare aimlessly at the shelves forever. Scaling a wooden ladder to reach the higher sections, she felt a strange pull toward a particular volume, its presence accompanied by the phantom sound of grinding gears and shifting fate. Her hand trembled slightly as pulled out a vibrant red book titled The Chronicles of the Elven Kingdom, its cover adorned with celestial motifs that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As she opened the pages, a mysterious, suffocating pressure filled the air, and the words began to glow with an ethereal light. She read of Shanoa Jonhanhart, the 14th ruler of the Elven Kingdom, a man whose military might was as legendary as his profound disdain for women. He was an iron-fisted dictator who had purged women from public life, confining them to the domestic sphere and clipping their wings with ruthless efficiency. His obsession with a male heir was pathological, yet the heavens seemed to mock him, granting him 6 daughters in a row until the oracle finally foretold the birth of a child who would lead the kingdom to unprecedented glory. Lost in the tragic history, Soyu's foot slipped on the ladder, and the world suddenly tilted into a terrifying abyss. The magical book slipped from her grasp as she plummeted toward the cold floor, the darkness swallowing her whole. But instead of the hard impact of the library floor, she felt the weight of a different reality pressing down on her. She found herself looking up at a man of godlike beauty, his features sharp and his aura so intimidating it felt like a physical weight. It was the king himself, his golden hair shimmering like a halo, though his eyes were devoid of any warmth. The scene felt impossibly vivid, the towering spires of the royal palace reaching toward a sky that wasn't her own. She lay in a lavish bedchamber where the air was thick with the scent of blood and sweat, the queen looking on with a mixture of exhaustion and profound dread. The king stood over them, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over the room as he demanded to see the child. The queen, her voice trembling with a mother's desperate love, named the child Snowfeather, hoping to soften the heart of the tyrant before her. Soyu's heart hammered against her tiny ribs as she realized the horrifying truth. She had been reincarnated into the very body of that cursed 7th princess. The tyrant's gaze was colder than winter snow as he lifted her up, his expression one of sheer disgust as he inspected the fragile creature in his hands. He handled her with no more care than one would a stray kitten, his fingers cold against her skin as he confirmed his worst fear. Outside the palace walls, the citizens gathered in the square, their voices a cacophony of speculation about whether the oracle's prophecy had finally been fulfilled. The gossip was cruel, whispers of how the previous concubines had been cast aside for failing to produce a son. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as the king finally stepped out onto the balcony, the sunlight glinting off his armor. With a flourish that felt more like a threat than a celebration, he hoisted the infant into the air for all to see. The kingdom of elves rejoiced as his booming voice proclaimed the birth of a prince named Zhao Ban. Soyu wanted to scream, to tell the cheering crowd that it was all a lie, but she was trapped in the useless body of an infant, her golden eyes wide with shock as the crowd erupted in celebration for a son that didn't exist. Back in the quiet of the Yao Yu palace, the queen wept over her daughter, her heart breaking for the life of deception that lay ahead for her poor Snowfeather. Koyu realized she was living through the darkest chapters of the book she had just been reading. The historical records were right. King Chinoa was a complete troll, had shamelessly passed off his younger brother's son as his own to secure the throne, all while hiding his true daughter away. The secret was paved with blood, as the birth mother of the real Zhao Ban had been executed without hesitation to ensure total silence. It felt like a waking nightmare, a reality so cruel she begged the heavens to let her wake up in her own bed. She thought back to her past life, the sting of being an orphan who had always yearned for the warmth of a complete family. She remembered the lonely child she once was, wandering through a world where she felt she didn't belong. Those memories of a simple dinner with parents she barely remembered felt like a cruel taunt in this new, dangerous life. The king's icy facade was a constant reminder of the peril she was in. She was just another disappointing daughter, a fragile thing of no value. There was no going back to the world of libraries and thesis papers. He held her by her clothes, looking at her with such indifference it made her blood run cold. muttering about how ignorant and fragile these daughters were. The physical pain of his rough handling made her wail, her tiny fists clenching in a futile protest against his tyranny. He viewed her as nothing more than a showpiece, an object to be manipulated for his own glory. He spoke of the oracle's prophecy with a chilling conviction, determined that his heir would lead the realm to glory regardless of the cost. The queen's face was a mask of pure terror, her eyes pleading for a mercy she knew the king was incapable of giving. Then came the final blow. He ordered her to be sent to the Tower of God, a place of sacrifice where those sent were never seen again, their souls supposedly welcomed by the divine while their bodies met a grisly end. The queen collapsed at his feet, begging for mercy for her own flesh and blood, her voice raw with agony. The king remained unmoved, his silence more terrifying than any shout as he stared down at his broken wife. He would never let the world know that his seventh child was a daughter. His pride was worth more than her life. The memory of the executed mother flashed through the queen's mind, a grim reminder of the curse that bound everyone to this lie. Finally, he gave a chilling ultimatum. She was to be sent away, and he was never to lay eyes on her again. A carriage waited outside the palace, a somber vessel for a princess being exiled before she could even walk. The queen watched through a veil of tears as her daughter was whisked away into the snowy night, a silent prayer on her lips that the child might somehow thrive. Soyu felt the cold wind of her new reality as she was carried toward the outskirts of a quaint town neighboring the royal castle. At the estate of Baron Vale, the maids were already whispering about the bastard child the baron had brought home, their voices dripping with judgment for a man they thought was upright and honest. Lady Catherine sat at her vanity, her heart heavy with the scandal that threatened to tear her family apart. She sighed for the tormented soul of the woman who'd been cast aside, unaware of the royal secret now sleeping under her roof. The household was in an uproar as the baron's sons rushed to the new addition, their youthful energy clashing with the somber mood of the house. 12-year-old Arnal was skeptical, his brow furrowed as he questioned the rumors he'd heard from the servants. Catherine tried to maintain order, scolding him for his recklessness even as her own heart was in turmoil. The eldest son, 15-year-old Muriel, was more reserved, while little 4-year-old Avery clung to his brother's leg, his eyes wide with curiosity about the baby. Baron Stephen stood before his family, his expression grave as he prepared to reveal the truth. From this day forward, he announced the baby in the cradle would be their little sister, and her name would be Yuki Vale. The atmosphere in the grand hall was thick with a suffocating tension, as the matriarch's voice trembled with the weight of a betrayal that threatened to shatter their family. She couldn't believe her husband had the audacity to return with a child born of another woman, a living testament to his infidelity. Amidst the storm of accusations, the fiery young Anar thrashed in his older arms, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and heartbreak as he screamed for his release. He couldn't understand why they were letting this old man tear their world apart so easily. Beside him, Muriel remained a pillar of icy calm, his statuesque features void of emotion as he tightened his brother, though his gaze remained as cold as a winter's frost. Even little Avery, usually so full of mischief, watched the unfolding drama with a suspicious glint in his emerald eyes, while the rest of the household seemed swallowed by a heavy, indigo gloom. The mother finally raised her hand, demanding silence with a weary authority that brooked no argument. She clutched the tiny, swaddled bundle in her arms, Arya, the innocent center of this whirlwind, and declared that she had already chosen to forgive the father's transgressions. But for Anar, forgiveness felt like a poison. He spat out his defiance, insisting that the man should be exiled to live his mistress rather than bring his shame into their home. The mother's patience snapped, her voice ringing out like a whip as she commanded silence, decreeing once and for all that Arya was now a member of their bloodline. Despite her proclamation, the resentment in the room didn't vanish. It only festered, visible in the way his teeth ground together in silent fury before he turned to storm away. He refused to acknowledge a child he viewed as a homewrecker's spawn, a girl whose very veins carried what he considered tainted blood. Little did they know, the infant in question was far more aware than she appeared, babbling nonsense, while her mind raced with the realization that surviving in this family would be an uphill battle against two very stubborn brothers. The mother watched her eldest go, sighing as she tasked the ever-composed Muriel with keeping an eye on his volatiles to prevent any impulsive disasters. Muriel gave a sharp, curt nod of obedience, though the look he cast toward the baby was chillingly detached that it made Arya shiver in her blankets. She realized then that these boys were going to be incredibly tough nuts to crack, especially as she overheard her parents whispering in the shadows about the dire necessity of keeping her true identity a secret from everyone, even their own children. Time passed in a blur of domestic routine, and Arya found herself surrounded by a doting army of maids who marveled at her health and sweetness. As they bathed her in a basin of warm suds, she couldn't help but reflect on her past life, wondering if her original parents had ever looked at her with such unadulterated joy. It was a genuinely ridiculous situation, being a grown soul trapped in a soft, chubby body, forced to endure the embarrassment of being handled like a fragile doll. One bright afternoon, the garden was alive with the song of birds and the golden glow of the sun, a perfect facade of peace. Arya was wheeled out in her ornate carriage, soaking in the fresh air under the watchful eyes of her mother and the maids. She basked in the warmth, feeling truly delighted to be alive. Nearby, Anar was playing with his golden retriever, Lucky, his laughter echoing through the trees as he tossed a ball for the eager hound. But the moment he spotted the carriage, his expression soured, his mind darkening with the thought of the other woman's kid invading his space. A wicked idea sparked in his eyes, and he intentionally hurled the ball directly toward the baby's path, calling for Lucky to fetch it with a reckless disregard for the consequences. The dog charged forward like a golden streak of lightning, a swoosh of movement that caught everyone off guard. Panic erupted in an instant as the mother tripped in her haste to protect her child, and Arya was sent tumbling through the air, the world spinning in a terrifying blur. A chorus of horrified screams filled the air as the father arrived on the scene, his face a mask of thunderous rage as he realized what Anar had done. Arya hit the grass with a dull thud, her tiny lungs letting out a piercing wail as the shock of the fall registered. The maids and her mother hovered over her, their faces pale with a suffocating pressure of fear as they searched for any signs of a permanent injury. The father rushed over, his voice laced with a rare, trembling concern as he checked on his newest daughter. Arya continued to cry, her head throbbing with a dull ache, though her internal monologue was more annoyed than truly traumatized. Thankfully, the doctor soon arrived and confirmed that she was perfectly fine, suffering only from a few minor scrapes that a dab of ointment would easily fix. Back in the safety of her nursery, the tension remained at a breaking point as the mother unleashed her full fury on Anar, grounding him for months and demanding a sincere apology for his heartless recklessness. Anar stood there, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white, his pride wounded and his resentment only deepening under the weight of his mother's disappointment. Muriel didn't make things any easier, bluntly calling his brother an idiot for his lack of foresight. As the brothers bickered in the hallway, Avery pulled Anar aside to whisper a bizarre secret, claiming that Arya was actually a witch. Muriel's eyes narrowed with a murderous aura as he overheard this, demanding to know exactly what Avery had done to reach such a conclusion. The young boy stammered, eventually confessing that he had tried to cast a low-level curse on the baby to give her boils, but to his shock, she had been completely immune. Muriel's gaze turned even colder, warning his younger brother of the dire trouble he would be in for using dark magic on a family member. Later, Anar approached Arya's crib with a heavy, reluctant heart, his shadow looming over the sleeping infant. Arya looked up at him, her large, sparkling eyes searching his face as she let out a soft, babbling sound. In that moment, she remembered the look on his face when she had fallen. He hadn't looked triumphant, desperately anxious and worried. Realizing he was just a confused child trying to protect his world from an outsider, she decided to weaponize her cuteness. She looked up at him with a wide, toothless grin and chirped a word that sounded suspiciously like brother. Anar froze, his breath catching in his throat as the sight of her pure, innocent smile hit him like a physical blow. His heart began to flutter with an unfamiliar warmth, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief. Slowly, his hand reached out, and his fingers were caught in Arya's tiny, soft grip. A blush crept onto his cheeks as he looked down her, the walls around his heart finally beginning to crumble. From the doorway, the parents watched the scene with a sense of profound relief, happy to see the icy barrier between the siblings finally starting to melt. Anar couldn't help but feel a sudden, overwhelming protectiveness, realizing that despite everything, she was just a little kid after all. Scared. The tiny girl giggled and babbled, putting on her best front of innocence while her emerald eyes sparkled with feigned joy. Anar was completely defenseless against such a display, his heart melting instantly as he swooned over her unbelievable cuteness. Avery watched from the sidelines with a suspicious gaze, wondering how a mere newborn could seem so unnervingly mature. Muriel didn't miss the irony, noting that Avery himself was far too advanced for a 4-year-old. Lady Catherine held the babe close, her expression softening until Einar poked his head into the room with cautious curiosity. He strutted inside with a youthful swagger, though his eyes never left the precious little bundle in his mother's arms. His excitement was palpable as he leaned over the crib, desperate for a reaction from his new sister. But his mother gently shooed him away, insisting that little Arya needed her rest. Anar grumbled about his 3-month grounding, whispering his confusion about why babies spent so much of their lives in slumber. He longed to play, staring down at her peaceful, sleeping face with a mixture of longing and boredom. Seeing his devotion, Lady Catherine tasked him with watching over the child to ensure she didn't tumble from the bed. She left the room with a satisfied smile, proud to see her son taking on such responsibility, unaware of the chaos brewing. The moment they were alone, Anar grew anxious at her stillness, poking her soft cheek to make sure she was actually alive. He marveled at the bouncy, velvet texture of her skin, his fear replaced by pure adoration the moment she began to stir. He chirped for her to wake up, declaring that her favorite big brother was finally here to play. Arya rubbed her eyes with a tiny fist, her internal monologue screaming in frustration at being disturbed. She felt as though a million noisy crows had invaded her dreams, only to realize the culprit was her own brother. Her little face scrunched up in a silent tantrum, cursing the brat who dared to ruin her precious nap. Oblivious to her rage, Anar's eyes shone with stars as he asked if she wanted him to hold her. She glared with all the intensity a baby could muster, wishing he would just vanish and let her sleep. His hands trembled with a mix of nerves and excitement as he reached out, finally lifting her from the safety of the crib. He found her surprisingly soft and was taken aback by how demanding her gaze felt, comparing her to the much meeker Avery. The sweet scent of a newborn filled his senses, and he decided she wasn't quite as annoying as he'd first thought. Arya, however, was paralyzed with fear, her little heart racing as she prayed the clumsy boy wouldn't drop her. The way he held her was dreadfully uncomfortable, and she silently berated him for having no idea how to handle a baby. Misinterpreting her silence for affection, Anar beamed with joy. Convinced that his sister truly loved him, he spun her around in a dizzying circle, declaring her his lucky charm and the best member of the Weir family. Arya's world blurred into a nauseating whirl, and she felt her soul leaving her body as he officially decided to accept her. In the quiet moments that followed, she reflected on her past life as a lonely orphan, finding it hard to believe she finally had a family. The warmth of the milk and the gentle care of Lady Catherine made her feel safe, a sensation she had never known before. But the exhaustion from playing with Anar was real, leaving her utterly wiped out and barely able to keep her eyes open. Life in the manor continued, and she sooned herself on the library floor, observing the Baron as he tutored his 3 sons. The atmosphere grew tense when the Baron decided to test Anar's progress in mathematics. The question was simple enough for an adult, but for a boy like Anar, it might as well have been a mountain. He sweated under the pressure, his mind a complete blank as he stared at the board. Muriel didn't hesitate to call him an idiot, his cold gaze piercing through his brother's incompetence. Avery, ever the prodigy, casually provided the correct answer, his voice void of any emotion. Arya watched intently, realizing this was her chance to understand the laws and education of this new world. She crawled closer to the boys, her sharp mind absorbing every detail of their lessons. She realized the harsh reality of her new world. The Baron threatened to send Anar to a church school if he didn't improve, a place where the clergy hoarded all the world's knowledge. Anar pleaded to take knight training instead, his dream of fighting in wars far more appealing than a life of prayer. Arya realized the education system here was as archaic as medieval Europe, with the church and royal tutors holding all the power. The dusty tomes held secrets she was desperate to unlock. Under the shimmering light of the stained glass windows, the Baron spoke of King Cyrus, boasting that under his reign, even the knights were literate. At the mention of that name, Arya's blood boiled. Cyrus was an absolute jerk who truly grounded her gears. When the next math problem appeared, Anar was once again drowning in a sea of confusion. He gripped his head in anxiety, the numbers dancing mockingly before his eyes. Unable to watch him suffer, Arya crawled forward and pointed directly to the correct option, desperate to help her brother. While Anar shouted the answer with newfound confidence, and the Baron confirmed his success. He was over the moon, showering Arya with kisses and declaring her his lucky charm once again. The library was filled with his boisterous laughter, a rare moment of peace in the household. But the peace was shattered when Avery looked at her with narrow, accusing eyes, stating flatly that she had cheated. He pointed a finger at the baby, claiming she was a witch who had whispered the answer to Anar. The Baron had to break up the ensuing fight, looking at Avery with a stern expression as he brought up the dark rumor that the boy had tried to curse his own sister. Arya froze in horror as she realized the little brat had actually used magic on her. Avery's internal monologue revealed a different truth. He had only wanted her to stop crying and was frustrated his magic hadn't worked. Suspecting she had an aberrant body that was naturally immune to his spells, Arya realized he was a master actor, hiding his true intentions behind a mask of innocence. He glared at her with a murderous aura, his eyes cold and calculating. Arya's heart pounded, wondering if he had figured out her secret identity, or that she wasn't from this world, yet she resolved to master this thing called magic herself. The nightmare was always the same, a suffocating memory of a life filled with shadows where a cruel, wretched woman sneered while yanking her hair with agonizing force. The bully's voice dripped with venom, mocking the girl's loneliness and demanding to know if an orphan like her even had a brother to save her from such a pathetic fate. It was a cold, heartless existence, and as the woman's face twisted into a demonic grin, the girl could only tremble in silence, her spirit nearly broken by the weight of her own misfortune. But then, the darkness shattered. 3 statuesque figures appeared like gods descending from the heavens, their military uniforms crisp and their gazes sharp enough to cut through any threat. One of them, a youth with eyes as clear as the sky, reached out and took her small, shaking hand with a tenderness she had never known, whispering comfort that felt like a warm embrace. His handsome face was a beacon of hope in that desolate dream, making her heart swell with a sudden, overwhelming sense of belonging. She looked at him with wide, shimmering eyes, finally realizing that she wasn't alone anymore. Then, with a start, the vision faded, and she opened her eyes to this reality of her nursery, realizing it was all just a dream of a future yet to come. Even as a baby, she couldn't help but reflect on her 3 new brothers. While Anar was a gentle soul in her dreams, his current reality was a bit more lacking in the brain department, and Muriel remained an unpredictable wild card. Then there was Avery, who had already branded her with his magic a debt she fully intended to settle one day. Her musings were interrupted by Catherine, who entered the room with a doting smile, ready to wake her little star for a day out in the world. Outside the window, the sun bathed the grand castle in a golden glow, a symbol of the power and prestige she now inhabited. In the bustling kitchens, the maids were already chirping with excitement, gossiping about Lady Catherine's plans to head into town town for a week-long shopping spree. They marveled at her generosity, green with envy over whoever would be lucky enough to accompany her. But the real shocker was that she was taking the tiny Miss Arya along. To them, Arya was an angel in human form, a child who never threw fits and possessed a sweetness that could melt the coldest heart. Catherine, however, was currently locked in a never-ending quest for the perfect outfit, shamelessly using her daughter as a living doll and trying on a gazillion different looks while Arya mentally sighed at the absurdity of it all. When Anar tried to join the excursion, his mother firmly reminded him that this was a trip for girly things and he belonged with his father and Muriel. The boy's expression turned comically serious as he insisted that Arya would surely perish from sorrow without his magnificent presence to protect her. He stood tall, brimming with a confidence only a young brother could possess, while Catherine just shook her head at his antics. Soon, they were moving through the vibrant streets of the city, a place Catherine found dull compared to the thrill of the outing, though she joked that Anar must have driven poor Arya absolutely bonkers by now. From her vantage point in Catherine's arms, Arya took in the bustling world, her sparkling eyes wide with wonder at the sheer scale of the city. The towering stone buildings loomed over the crowded thoroughfares, reminding her of the ancient, beautiful architecture of Dubrovnik from her past life. Her attention was soon drawn to a magnificent cathedral where priests in ornate robes moved with solemn grace, a reminder that in this world, people bowed before a god and sought the mysterious Tower of God. It was said that this divine power granted magic to the chosen few, a concept that felt both fantastical and intimidating. She couldn't help but wonder what magic truly was and if a small, seemingly insignificant girl could ever hope to wield it. Their journey eventually led them to a high-end dessert shop, a favorite haunt for Anar, where Catherine planned to pick up some treats for the family. As they stepped inside like an establishment, a voice called out to Catherine, breaking the peaceful atmosphere. A group of noble women sat at a table, their fans fluttering like the wings of predatory birds as they watched them approach. One woman, hidden behind a floral hat, sneered this must be the child everyone had been whispering about, her voice dripping with hidden malice. Arya felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew this look all too well. Trouble was brewing. The woman continued her verbal assault, suggesting that after all the family drama, Catherine should be too ashamed to even show her face in public. They whispered about Baron Ware's supposed madness and the mysterious woman he was shielding, their eyes flashing with a cruel, condescending sympathy. A sarcastic smile curled on the woman's lips as she mocked Catherine's situation, her eyes remaining as cold as ice despite her fake words of concern. Catherine tried to laugh it off, but the atmosphere was thick with suffocating pressure, leaving Arya to wonder why they had even bothered coming to this viper's nest. The gossip turned even viler as they labeled Arya the mistress's child, a rotten stain on a noble house. Looking at their smug faces, Arya realized that no matter the world or the era, the strong would always find a way to prey on the weak. The woman even had the audacity to suggest that Catherine send the child away to the church to avoid future inheritance squabbles. But before the insult could fully land, a splash of tea suddenly ruined the woman's expensive gown. Arya looked up with the most innocent, wide-eyed expression she could muster, babbling nonsense, as if she were just a clumsy baby who didn't know her own strength. Catherine quickly jumped to her defense, asking if her precious girl had choked and subtly reminding the ladies that dignified noblewoman wouldn't hold a grudge against a mere infant. To seal the deal, Arya looked Catherine straight in the eye and called her mama for the first time, her voice a tiny, sweet chirp. The effect was instantaneous. Catherine was moved to the point of tears, pulling Arya into a tight, loving embrace and kissing her chubby cheek. The noblewomen could only stare in stunned silence as their prey turned the tables on them. Catherine beamed with pride, declaring that this child was closer to her than her own flesh and blood, and that a loyal daughter was worth more than any social standing. She gently patted Arya's head, her heart overflowing with genuine affection, creating a scene of such pure maternal love that it felt as if flowers were blooming in the air around them. The lead bully was left fuming, her face contorted with rage as she clenched her handkerchief in a futile attempt to maintain her dignity. Desperate to change the subject, another woman asked about Lady Ruth's connection to the palace. Ruth preened, mentioning her sister was the personal maid to the little prince, a boy named Lucian. The prestige came with a dark price as she whispered that the previous maid had been executed and the staff was replaced every 6 months. Ruth laughed it off, confident her sister would survive where others failed. But the name Lucian triggered a terrifying memory in Arya's mind. She remembered the book, the history of the Elven Kingdom, and the strict murderous of the man named Cyrus who kept the prince's identity a secret. In the original story, the Ware family had treated her well during a brief, peaceful childhood, but everything changed when she lost her magic. Once she became a normal person, her life transformed into an inescapable tragedy, where she was manipulated like a puppet on strings, totally at the mercy of those who sought to use her. She couldn't let history repeat itself. She refused to be a victim again. To survive, she needed power, and in this world, that meant one thing: magic. Her eyes darted around until they landed on exactly what she needed: a beginner's guide to the mystic arts. They were in a bookstore, and while Catherine was busy buying a mountain of books for Muriel, Arya began to point and babble with desperate intensity at the specific tome she wanted. Catherine was amused, wondering why a child who couldn't even read would be so attached to a book on magic. But as she bought it, Arya hugged the heavy volume to her chest with a triumphant, sparkling smile, knowing that this was the first step toward rewriting her destiny. Little Arya's eyes flickered with a strange, intelligent light as she surveyed the mountain of luxury before her. To the doting maids, it was just a child playing, but Arya was on a mission, crawling across the polished floor with a determination that defied her tiny stature. The air was thick with anticipation as the women leaned in, whispering among themselves about what the precious lady would choose to be her first treasure. With a triumphant huff, she bypassed the glittering jewels and soft silks, her chubby hands slamming down onto a heavy tome titled A Beginner's Guide to Magic. Her lime-green eyes sparkled with a secret hunger for knowledge, and soon she was utterly lost in the pages, her small frame hushed over the complex diagrams as if she could absorb the ancient secrets through her very skin. The maids could only watch in stunned silence, wondering if their little mistress was actually wisdom personified, a genius born into a baby's body. Arya didn't care for their chatter. She was reeling from the shock that, although the language of this world was entirely foreign, she could somehow read it perfectly. It was a miracle, a sign that her new life in Lunaris would be anything but ordinary. She devoured the text, learning of a world crafted by a god who scattered power into every nook and cranny, where spells were the sacred keys to unlocking the universe. It seemed that in this realm, mastering spells was the only path to true strength, a mandatory hurdle for anyone seeking to weave the elements themselves. But just as she reached the most interesting part, a shadow fell over her. A maid, well-meaning but utterly suffocating, dangled a pair of ridiculous B-shaped hairpins in front of her face, cooing as if she were a simpleton. Arya's brow furrowed in genuine irritation, her heart screaming for just a moment of independence and peace from these relentless distractions. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where a statuesque figure sat bathed in the afternoon sun. It was Muriel, her eldest brother, looking like a cold, ethereal prince as he focused on his own studies. He was the picture of aloof elegance, his expression void of the childish warmth that filled the rest of the house. Arya felt a prickle of jealousy. He had everything she craved: height, freedom, and the quiet respect of everyone around him. Even at dinner, the atmosphere was dominated by her peculiar habits, with her mother fretting over how the baby had abandoned her naps in favor of heavy books. It was grand, lit by a massive chandelier. But the peace was shattered by her younger brother, Anar, who whispered spitefully that her innocent look was nothing but a fake mask for a tiny witch. The table was a study in contrasts: the fierce and rowdy Anar, the calm, unbothered Muriel, and Arya, caught in the middle of their scrutiny. Their father, Baron Ware, only laughed, his heart melting as he imagined his daughter growing up to join them at the table properly. He beamed with a doting pride, unaware of the storm brewing. Suddenly, a sharp click echoed through the hall, and the world was plunged into an abyssal darkness. Anar shrieked in terror, convinced the manor was haunted, while their mother tried to maintain order amidst the suffocating pressure of the gloom. Arya remained remarkably still, realizing with a start that even a magical world suffered from the mundane inconvenience of a power outage. But the darkness didn't last. A violent whoosh air preceded a burst of brilliant, searing orange flames. Muriel stood there, his hand outstretched as if he were a god commanding the sun itself. The fire didn't just burn, it danced, coiling into the majestic shape of a phoenix that bathed the entire room in a golden glow. Arya's jaw dropped, her heart racing as she witnessed the raw, beautiful power of true magic for the first time. With a casual flick of his wrist, Muriel sent the embers flying to ignite every candle in the room, restoring light with a terrifying efficiency. The dining hall was once again visible, the family frozen in awe of the young prodigy who stood there as if he hadn't just performed a miracle. Arya stared at him, her curiosity piqued to its limit. He was a master of the flame, a teenager who carried the weight of a legendary mage. Determined to get closer to this source of power, Arya began stalking him, eventually finding her way into his private sanctuary. She waited by the door, listening for the click of the handle. And when Muriel entered, he found the room seemingly empty until he looked down. There she was, a persistent little creature looking up at him with keen, unblinking eyes. Muriel's patience was paper-thin. He marched her back to their mother, complaining that the baby was zooming around like a possessed doll and making him trip. While Arya played the part of a dejected, drooping bunny, their mother only chuckled, convinced that the child simply adored her big brother. Muriel's gaze remained icy, his irritation clear as he looked down at the nuisance clinging to him. Arya realized then that she had finally met her match. Was the ultimate brainiac, a genius who had been scouted by scholars at the age of 10 and now studied alongside royalty. He was a boy whose entire world was made of ink and parchment, someone who viewed social interactions as a waste of time. He was the star of the Royal Academy, and Arya found herself being dragged along on his journey, even if it was just as a prop. As they arrived at the academy gates, a swarm of noble girls descended upon Muriel like hungry predators. They fluttered their lashes and begged for a moment of his time. But Muriel didn't even blink. He reached down and adjusted Arya's bonnet, lifting her up with a flat, unapologetic expression as he claimed he was too busy babysitting his sister to entertain them. The girls were stunned, their smiles faltering as they were forced to retreat. Anar watched the scene with a mix of shock and confusion, while the rejected noblewoman stomped away in a huff. Muriel's explanation was cold and practical. That girl was a duke's daughter, and since their family was only at the bottom of the aristocratic barrel as barons, he needed a foolproof excuse to avoid her without causing a diplomatic incident. He looked down at Arya, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the situation. He shamelessly admitted that she was proving to be a very handy tool for social evasion. Arya's indignation flared. Was she really just a shield to him? But her anger vanished the moment they entered the Royal Academy classroom. She was tucked into Muriel's lap as he took meticulous notes, and as the professor began a lecture on the mechanics of casting a fireball, Arya realized she had stumbled into a goldmine. The teacher explained that one must sense the humidity and temperature of the room to bend the fire to their will. While Muriel focused on the complex intersection of chemistry and physics, Arya felt like cheering with excitement. She had been trying so hard to butter him up, and yet here she was, getting a front row seat to the most elite magical education in the kingdom by sheer accident. Muriel looked down and poked her chubby cheek, perhaps sensing her strange intensity. Arya puffed out her face, wondering what on earth he was thinking, only to be met with a rare, devastatingly handsome smile that softened his usual murderous aura. From that day on, she became his constant shadow, following him from the quiet rows of the library to the echoing halls of the gymnasium. He used her as a shield against every girl who tried to approach, and even on their days off, he refused to let anyone else hold her. Anar could only watch from the sidelines, fuming at his brother's sudden possessiveness, while Arya realized that this was officially the start of a very dangerous, very magical new chapter in her life. And 5 years have bled into the past, and a secret letter is meticulously penned, detailing how the little princess has blossomed into a beacon of warmth and intelligence. Under the watchful, doting eyes of Muriel, she is a scholar in the making, yet she still possesses the wild, vibrant spirit to race through the gardens with Anar. To those around her, she is nothing less than a little angel sent from the heavens, a testament to a sacred bloodline that must remain hidden. But even as the letter prays for a distant reunion with the Emperor, the air in the estate grows thick with a suffocating pressure. Baron Ware and Catherine exchange heavy glances. Knowing this might be the final correspondence they dare to send while the political tides are so treacherous. Catherine clutches the parchment, her heart aching with the hope that as long their precious Arya is safe, the distant mother will find peace. In the sun-drenched garden, Arya has already begun her own silent battle, shamelessly weaponizing her cuteness to charm the maids into a state of absolute adoration. She knows that in this life she cannot afford to be the wretched, helpless girl of her past. She must weave a web of connections to survive. With sparkling eyes and a mischievous grin, she regales her captive audience with the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, her small voice carrying the weight of a soul far older than 5 years. From the shadows of the balcony, her parents watch with a mixture of pride and paralyzing fear. Weir notes with a frown that she is far from an average child, her brilliance shining too brightly for their quiet corner of the world. Catherine sighs, her voice trembling as she remarks that Arya acts more like a mini-adult than a toddler, a realization that brings more dread than comfort. Weir's expression hardens, his eyes clouding with the worry that a passing prince or a calculating minister might notice her light and drag her into the lethal drama of the imperial court. They must guard her secret identity at all costs, but their whispered conspiracy is shattered by a sharp knock. Muriel enters, his statuesque frame casting a long shadow as he demands that Arya receive a formal education befitting her genius. He insists that early learning is the only path forward, regardless of the danger. Muriel is a man of ambition, and he cannot stand to see his sister's potential wasted while he is away at school. He warns his parents that if Arya is nurtured, she will become a figure the entire country will be forced to acknowledge, the very thing Weir fears most. Catherine gasps, her hand flying to her chest as she pleads for Arya to simply stay by her side, safe and invisible. Muriel is baffled by her resistance, unable to understand why they would choose obscurity over honor. Weir dismisses him coldly, stating there is no rush to thrust the child into the spotlight. The tension erupts into a massive argument that echoes through the halls, leaving the servants whispering in the shadows. Avery, the middle brother, listens with a face twisted in silent, murderous resentment. He watches as the door slams shut on his brother's fury, his heart hardening into a stone of jealousy. To Avery, Arya is nothing but a wretched interloper who stole the sun from his sky. He remembers a time when he was the one adored, the one his mother and brothers doted upon with endless affection. But then she arrived and the world began to revolve around the illegitimate child, leaving him to starve for a single scrap of attention. He watches Muriel hold her with such tenderness, a privilege Avery is denied, and his blood boils at how easily everything is handed to her. When Arya tries to approach him with her usual innocent charm, she is met with a gaze so cold it freezes the blood in her veins. Avery's voice is a low hiss of pure hatred as he declares that he will never, ever accept her. Arya stands frozen, the shock of his rejection piercing through her carefully built composure. She realizes then that despite her efforts, she cannot win them all. Avery's grudge is a poison she cannot cure. Later, as she sits in Anar's room, the weight of her predicament settles over her. While Anar wails over the triviality of homework, Arya's mind is a battlefield of strategy. She understands the paralyzing fear holding Weir back, the fear that a scholar will recognize her royal blood and lead her to the executioner's block. A vision of her own death, lying broken among blood-red roses, flashes before her eyes. She knows that if she remains weak and uneducated, she is merely a lamb waiting for the slaughter. She cannot let her family tear itself apart over her future. Ignoring Anar's childish tantrums, she resolves to take matters into her own hands and seeks out Muriel. Anar, convinced she is abandoning him because he is dumb, falls into a fit of dramatic despair. Arya finds Muriel in his private chambers, the air between them thick with unspoken plans. She questions if his scheme will truly work, her voice small but steady. Muriel looks at her with piercing blue eyes, questioning if she truly wishes to remain uneducated, or if she is merely scared of the illegitimate label. Arya meets his gaze head-on, declaring that as long as her family loves her, the whispers of the world are nothing but dust. Muriel's heart softens as he asks if that includes his love as well. Confident in her conquest of his heart, Arya beams, asserting that, of course, he loves her. A rare smile graces Muriel's lips as he pats her head, promising to cease his fighting with their father. He has a plan, one that will secure her future without igniting a war within their home. Days later, a magnificent carriage rolls up to the estate, signaling the arrival of a guest of immense importance. The maids scurry about in a frenzy of preparation, their whispers reaching Arya's curious ears. She creeps toward the drawing room, her heart thumping against her ribs as she peeks through the heavy doors. There, she sees a distinguished man with silver hair engaging her parents in a serious discussion about Muriel's exceptional future. The man is Dr. David, a renowned scholar who wishes for Muriel to become his protégé and an educator for the nation. Catherine is overcome with honor, her face glowing with a pride that momentarily masks her fear. But as Arya tries to get a better look, she accidentally collides with a maid, sending a tray of snacks crashing to the floor. Frozen in embarrassment as the drawing room falls silent, she looks up to see Muriel's amused gaze. He beckons her inside with a gentle call, inviting the little intruder into the center of the storm. Arya steps forward, her cheeks flushed pink, looking every bit the sparkling, innocent angel that could melt even the coldest of hearts. Stalemate. The atmosphere in the room was thick with scholarly prestige as Muriel introduced his little sister to the man he admired most. Little Arya Ware, with her sparkling emerald eyes and soft golden hair, looked like a literal angel descended from the heavens. Dr. David, the silver-haired scholar with a sharp monocle and an even sharper mind, couldn't believe his eyes. He never expected the normally cold and standoffish Muriel to have such a precious, soft-looking little sister. As they sat for tea, Arya felt a strange, suffocating pressure as the adult's gaze fell upon her. Muriel urged her to greet his mentor, a man known throughout the Elven Kingdom as a legendary scholar and the personal favorite of King Cyrus himself. Arya's heart skipped a beat as she realized the gravity of the man standing before her. This was the educational trailblazer from the books. Her father watched the interaction with bated breath, his face etched with a mixture of pride and underlying terror. If Arya stood out too much, or if her true brilliance was noticed by the court, their peaceful life would be over in an instant. She had to be careful. One wrong move and her cover as a simple, innocent child would be blown, putting her entire family on pins and needles. To survive this encounter, she decided to shamelessly weaponize her cuteness. With a small, calculated whimper, she scurried behind Muriel's legs, clutching his trousers as if the world itself was far too frightening for a little girl. Muriel nearly choked on his tea, his eyes widening in utter disbelief at his sister's sudden transformation into a shy wallflower. Her father, however, let out a silent sigh of relief, praising her internally for her quick wit and acting skills. Arya peeked out from her hiding spot, her gaze meeting Dr. David's with the perfect amount of feigned trepidation. The scholar was completely fooled, concluding that she was just a typical, harmless scaredy cat who wouldn't leave a lasting impression on anyone important. Muriel, however, wasn't ready to give up on showing her off, begging her to recite the hundreds of digits of pi he knew she had effortlessly memorized. Arya shook her head desperately, acting as if she didn't know what he was talking about, leaving her brother in a state of comedic, windy despair. She fled to the safety of her mother's embrace, her heart still hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As the adults began to discuss the Elven Queen, Arya's thoughts drifted to her true mother, the woman she hadn't seen since the very moment of her birth. The men spoke of King Cyrus's legendary conquests and the grace of Queen Alida, the woman whose kindness was said to be a gift to the entire kingdom. But then, a disastrous slip of the tongue changed everything. Caught up in her own memories, Arya accidentally whispered a rare, beautiful poem dedicated to the queen, her voice small but clear enough to stop the room. The silence that followed was heavy as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Dr. David's hand stilled, his curiosity piqued to a dangerous degree as he realized the rarity of those words. He leaned in, his gaze piercing through her as he asked how a mere 5-year-old could possibly know such an obscure piece of literature. Thinking on her feet and out of options, Arya lied through her teeth, claiming a traveling bard had once sung it at their house. The excuse worked, but it led to a terrifying outcome. Dr. David presented an official invitation to the royal court banquet, insisting she was the perfect guest. Her father's mind raced with the risks of letting her return to the palace after 5 long years, but he knew this might be their only chance for a reunion. The decision was made. It was time to finally face the past and attend the audience with Her Majesty. Soon, was a whirlwind of activity as the family prepared for their return to the royal stage. Silk and lace filled the rooms as maids prepared exquisite gowns for the grand occasion. Arya stood still as a statue, while a flurry of bows and ribbons were prepared to transform her into a perfect noble lady. Her mother, overwhelmed with joy, fitted her into a dress adorned with pink bows, celebrating their return to society after 20 years of being ignored. Her brother Avery, ever the narcissist, fretted over his own appearance, worried a simple hat wouldn't justice to his incredibly handsome face. Strict etiquette lessons followed, with the teacher demonstrating the proper hand-kissing ritual required at the palace. The day of the banquet arrived, and the entire manor was buzzing with an electric, busy energy. Avery, despite his earlier complaints, looked sharp and unperturbed in his formal attire, though he still acted as if the whole thing was beneath him. Arya approached him, her presence like a ray of sunshine in the bustling hallway. She begged him to enjoy the banquet with her smile bright enough to melt the coldest heart. He shot her a look of pure annoyance, flatly refusing her invitation. Arya puffed out her cheeks in a cute pout, frustrated by his difficult and stubborn nature. Yet, despite his protests, he couldn't help but follow along, unable to truly leave his sister alone. Deep in the heart of the royal palace, Dr. David was already making his move, pleading with the king to reconsider his stance on education. He argued that talent existed even among commoners, mentioning a student whose brilliance was 1,000 times greater than his own. He begged the king to sign the Public Education Act for the sake of the nation's strength. But the king was a man of iron and ice, his voice dripping with misogyny as he declared that girls had no need for such things. Dr. David didn't back down, showing the king a portrait of Arya and describing her as a once-in-a-generation genius from the Weir family. The picture showed a girl with eyes that sparkled like gems, yet the king remained unmoved. He merely scoffed and dismissed the scholar, ending the conversation with a cold finality. The king watched from his window as David left, his expression unreadable and full of hidden pressure. He didn't care for the girl or her family, clutching the proposal with a hand that knew only power. Without a second thought, he dumped the papers into the trash, as if they were nothing but filth. Finally, the heavy, ornate doors of the banquet hall swung open. Arya stepped into the grand room, her eyes wide as she took in the glittering chandeliers and the sea of noble faces. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a smell that felt hauntingly familiar to her soul. Her heart swelled with a mixture of grief and longing as she remembered the mother who had once held her. It had been 5 long years. But she was finally back where she belonged. The grand ballroom of the royal palace was a shimmering sea of opulence, teeming with the most influential nobles and exotic figures from across the continent. Amidst the clinking of crystal and the hum of polite laughter, talk turned to the kingdom's prosperity. Fueled by the king's iron-fisted military triumphs and the queen's legendary grace, it was a delicate balance of power, maintained by these monthly gatherings that were said to be a blessing from the throne itself. Yet, a shadow hung over the festivities as word spread that the queen, usually the heart of such events, was bedridden with a sudden illness. Little Arya felt a pang of disappointment. She had hoped to catch even a glimpse of the woman who held such a pivotal role in this world. The air in the hall grew stifling, and Arya, feeling the need for a momentary escape, decided to slip away to find the restroom, assuring her parents she could manage perfectly well on her own. As she stepped into the cool, moonlit gardens, the silence felt heavy with the weight of destiny. She couldn't help but recall the tragic narrative of the original story, where the girl named Arya never saw the queen again after the day she was cast out at birth. By being here now, she was actively rewriting the stars, changing a timeline that was never meant to include her presence in these halls. But her moment of reflection was cut short by a crushing realization. She was utterly and hopelessly lost. Her past life's curse of being directionally challenged had followed her into this new world, leaving her stranded in a maze of hedges and shadows. Panic began to bubble in her chest as she looked around, finding not a single soul to guide her back to safety. Suddenly, the leaves rustled, a sharp, unnatural sound that made her heart skip a beat. She froze, her breath hitching as a suffocating pressure filled the air, signaling the arrival of someone truly dangerous. From the darkness emerged a man of statuesque beauty, his red military uniform sharp against the night, but his eyes were obscured by a chilling shadow. His voice was like a blade, demanding to know who this intruder was, and what business she had trespassing in his domain. Arya's legs turned to jelly, her entire body trembling under the weight of his gaze. In that instant, her mother's warning echoed in her mind: stay silent, stay hidden, and never, ever attract attention. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Standing before her was Cyrus, the very man whose name was synonymous with terror. Desperation took hold as she turned to flee, but her small feet tripped over the cobblestones, sending her tumbling toward the ground. Before she could impact the earth, she was hoisted into the air, caught by the very man she feared most. Surrounded by guards with their weapons drawn, she felt like a trapped bird in a cage of steel. Cyrus held her aloft with effortless strength, his expression one of bored indifference, as if he were inspecting a curious insect. Her eyes widened in sheer terror, meeting his cold, emerald gaze that held no warmth, only a piercing, godlike judgment. The aura projected was not human. It was the murderous pressure of a demon, a soul-crushing weight that threatened to extinguish her very will to live. He looked at her as if she were a blemish on his perfect garden, his lips curling in a faint, cruel twist. The guards' accusations were a blur of noise, their swords gleaming in the moonlight as they declared her a trespasser who had dared to disturb the king's peace. Arya felt the cold bite of fear as she realized her life hung by a single thread. Cyrus's next words were a death sentence, a casual command to simply dispose of the nuisance. In her mind, the world went terrifying premonition of a game over that was coming far too soon. She tried to speak, to beg, but her throat was tight with tears as she looked up at the man who held her fate in his hands. He leaned in closer, his voice a low growl, asking if the pathetic creature even had the capacity for speech. Arya clutched her dress until her knuckles turned white, her mind racing for a way to survive this encounter. She was paralyzed, wondering if this was truly the end, if she would die at the hands of the kingdom's most feared tyrant. But then, the intensity in his eyes shifted, replaced by something even more stinging, pure, unadulterated disgust. To him, she wasn't a threat. She was a pitiable, homeless stray, a creature so beneath him it wasn't even worth the effort of an execution. He sneered, remarking on how helpless and wretched she looked, trembling like a lost dog in the rain. The humiliation was sharp, but it was also her salvation. With a dismissive wave, he ordered his men to find out where this thing belonged and return it to its owners. The guards quickly moved to obey, their previous aggression turning into a stern efficiency. Cyrus turned his back on her, his cape billowing as he walked away without a second glance, leaving Arya gasping for air in the wake of his departure. She was led back toward the light and noise of the banquet hall, her mind still reeling from the brush with death. As they reached the entrance, the guards' presence sparked a wave of hushed gossip among the waiting nobles. They whispered about the lucky little girl who had received a royal escort, their eyes filled with envy and curiosity. Little did they know that the luck they spoke of was actually a narrow escape from a monster's whims. Arya stood there, a small, fragile figure against the grand golden doors, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She saw the shocked faces of the ladies behind their fans, their superficial wonder a stark contrast to the cold reality she had just faced. The guards finally released her, disappearing back into the shadows of the palace as if they had never been there. Moments later, her parents appeared, their faces etched with a frantic worry that vanished the moment they saw her. Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, thanking the heavens that she was safe. Arya didn't say a word about the encounter with Cyrus, knowing that the truth would only bring terror to those she loved. She simply took her mother's hand, looking back one last time at the dark gardens and realizing with a shudder that she had truly dodged a bullet this time. The golden morning sun spilled through the curtains, yet the warmth failed to reach the little girl tucked beneath her blankets. Stay put, the command echoed in her mind as she lay there, a tiny figure lost in a sea of silk. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of the previous day, haunted by the memory of that Maarent, whose presence was a suffocating pressure of murderous aura. Just a single glance from those piercing eyes had been enough to freeze the blood in her veins. Oh, how absolutely annoying this situation was. The mere memory of him made the threat of death feel far too real, a constant chill down her spine that reminded her of the tragic ending written in the book she was desperately trying to avoid. Downstairs, the atmosphere at the breakfast table was heavy with a different kind of tension. Ever since they had returned from the palace party, something had been dreadfully off with Arya, her usual bubbly spirit replaced by a vacant, haunted stare. Her mother's face was etched with worry, wondering what could have possibly happened to her precious girl, while the maid reported that Arya refused to leave her bed. Her older brother watched with a furrowed brow, his heart aching at the thought of his sister coming down with some mysterious illness. When the younger brother dared to suggest she might be possessed, his mother didn't hesitate to deliver a swift, comical smack to the back of his head to silence such nonsense. But the older brother couldn't shake of Arya standing so small and fragile amidst the cold stone walls of the palace, wondering who exactly she had run into in those hallowed, dangerous halls. High above in the royal palace, the source of her nightmares sat behind a massive mahogany desk. King Cyrus, a statuesque figure of intimidating beauty, leaned back with a bored, unreadable expression. He rested his chin on his hand, the very air around him thick with a suffocating pressure. With a sharp snap of his fingers, he summoned a flurry of documents that danced through the air. His gaze fell upon a single file, a report on the pathetic little stray he had encountered. There she was, looking up from the parchment with big, sparkling eyes and a smile that far too innocent for his world. A flicker of interest crossed his godlike features as he contemplated the strange child, while miles away, a meeting was being held in the principal's office. Underneath a grand desk, a pair of legs shifted restlessly. Kane entered the room with a click of the door, asking if Dr. David needed him for something. The doctor adjusted his monocle, looking every bit the sophisticated scholar as he revealed some rather interesting news. His Majesty the King had finally caved, and Arya was going to get a shot at attending the prestigious royal primary school. It was fantastic news that made Kane's heart swell with pride. However, the doctor's expression turned serious as he added a terrifying caveat. The king wanted to personally interview the girl before any enrollment was finalized. Arya's world shattered at the news, her face turning a pale shade of purple as she realized she had to face the tyrant once again. Even as her brother offered a comforting pat on the head, she felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter. She looked down, her small hands trembling at the thought of the upcoming ordeal. At the palace, the council chamber was a battlefield of egos, with elderly nobles thumping the table in outrage over new educational acts. They ranted about the cost and the audacity of teaching commoners, pleading for the king to stand up for their outdated privileges. But Cyrus was already elsewhere, his mind focused on the clock as his aide noted that it was finally time for the interview. Arya stood alone in the center of a vast, echoing hall, her tiny form swallowed by the immense architecture. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs as the maids left her in the massive, intimidating space. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her every move. High on the balcony, Cyrus watched her, noting how she looked utterly lost and fearful. She looked definitely scared, a tiny speck on the marble floor. Cyrus observed her closely, seeing a girl who was fearful, timid, and utterly lost. But then, her fear was momentarily eclipsed by genuine wonder as she spotted a beautiful statue, her eyes widening with a childlike sparkle. She reached out to touch the smooth fabric of the sculpted dress, only to recoil in a panic, praying that nobody had witnessed her lack of etiquette. Cyrus's lips twitched into a rare, genuine smile. This girl was far more sensitive and precocious than she seemed. He decided it was time to head down and check out this intriguing creature for himself. The sound of his boots clicking against the marble floor sent a jolt of pure electricity through Arya. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock as she realized the king himself was standing right there. "See Cyrus!" Her mind screamed in terror, her eyes spinning in a dizzying spiral of panic. Desperate to survive, she dropped into the deepest, most respectful bow she could muster, wondering how long he had been lurking there, watching her like a predator. Cyrus questioned why she wasn't scared of him anymore, referring to their last icy encounter. Arya decided to shamelessly weaponize her cuteness, telling him that her mother said he's a god to be revered, so she shouldn't be scared of someone so wise and brave. It was a blatant attempt at buttering him up, a gamble to avoid the executioner's block. Cyrus looked down at her, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes as he saw right through her act. He didn't feel angry, instead he saw a reflection of his own younger self in her clever, calculating eyes, remembering how he once handled the big shots on the throne with the same forced charm. He leaned in, asking if she truly wanted to attend his school. Arya didn't hesitate, despite the risk of blowing her cover. She knew she needed the power of magician to finally control her own fate. Later, as they sat in the sun-drenched garden for tea, Arya to keep her cool while sitting so close to the big jerk, who held her life in his hands. Cyrus watched her over the rim of his golden teacup, questioning why a child of only 5 or 6 would want to waste her time studying. Arya set her cup down, her expression hardening with a resolve that far surpassed her years. With a voice that didn't tremble, she declared that she wanted to become a magician, her green eyes burning with a fire that promised she would never be a pathetic stray again. The golden-haired tyrant sat with an air of absolute authority, his gaze narrowing as he questioned if the little Gurhim was merely a puppet for Dr. David's ambitions. He looked down at her from his statuesque height, sipping his tea with a cold skepticism that would have made a grown man tremble. Arya knew she had to play her cards right, desperately trying to stroke his ego by calling him one of the greatest names in magic. She prattled on about the elven royal family's legacy, hoping her innocent chatter would soften the sharp edges of his temper. In her mind, she saw him as a godlike figure with ancient knowledge, a vision of power that both terrified and fascinated her. She weaponized her cuteness, her eyes sparkling like gems as she tried to win over the stone-faced ruler. Mir watched from the side, his heart in his throat as the king's gaze shifted to him with a sharp, piercing glare. The suffocating pressure in the room intensified as the king demanded to know if Muriel was truly the scholar he was rumored to be. Arya didn't hesitate to boast about her brother, her voice full of pride as she claimed he was the very best. She watched the king carefully, beginning that maybe, just maybe, this legendary tyrant wasn't as scary as the stories suggested. But the peace was short-lived when he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous low as he asked what she could actually do to prove her worth. He wanted to put her to the test right then and there, his eyes flashing with a predatory interest. This was her one shot, an interview she couldn't afford to fail if she wanted to save her family from ruin. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything, that would impress a man who had seen it all. Then it hit her. She would use the power of her past life's education to stun him into silence. With a confident smile, she announced she could recite you of pi to 100 decimal places. The room fell into a stunned silence as the numbers began to pour from her lips with perfect precision. The king froze, his cup pausing halfway to his lips as the sheer impossibility of the feat registered. Muriel and the maids looked on in absolute horror and awe, wondering if the child had been possessed by a mathematical demon. But instead of praise, a sudden violent thud echoed through the hall as the king slammed his hand down, his contorting in a mask of suppressed agony. A ghostly presence seemed to shimmer behind him, the memory of a woman wearing a crown, his late sister, whose brilliant mind was her only equal. The atmosphere turned murderous. He stood, his aura so dark it felt like the very walls were closing in. He couldn't bear it. The reminder was too painful, too raw. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he bellowed for someone to take her away, demanding she be cast out of the palace immediately. Arya was left reeling, her small frame trembling as she wondered what she could have possibly done to trigger such a violent reaction. She stood amongst the weeping maids, a tiny, dejected figure in a sea of regal indifference. Even Muriel was stunned, confirming with a heavy heart that she hadn't missed a single digit. The king's glare followed them out, a cold promise of future storms. Whispers filled the garden as they left, the staff recalling that only the king's eldest sister had ever possessed such a memory. Arya was led away like a common criminal, her heart heavy with the fear that she had doomed the Ware family. As the carriage pulled away, she looked back at the imposing palace, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. Had she truly messed everything up by trying too hard? Back at the palace, the king stood alone in the dark, the silence of the hall a suffocating weight. With a swift, graceful movement, he drew a blade and sliced through a candle, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and grief. He was a man haunted by the past, a tyrant who could find no peace even in his own home. He screamed for everyone to leave him, his voice echoing with a loneliness that no crown could ever cure. Word of his fury spread through the streets like wildfire, with commoners whispering that the Ware family's days were surely numbered. Arya spent a week on pins and needles, jumping at every shadow as she waited for the executioner's knock. Fortunately, no punishment came, but the anxiety remained a constant companion. To help her, Riel decided to take her on a trip to Doc David's estate, a beautiful castle where the academic elite gathered. Her mother fretted over her, checking her bags and worrying if her little girl was truly safe after the disaster at the palace. Muriel promised to protect her, even as their younger brother Anar threw a tantrum about being left behind. Anar couldn't understand why the little witch got to go while he stayed home, his face red with jealousy. Muriel made quick work of the brat's complaints, pulling him aside with a firm hand. As the carriage clattered toward the Earl of Devonshire's castle, Arya to push the memory of the king's face out of her mind, she felt a pang of guilt, worrying that her failure had caused her brother more trouble than he deserved. Muriel noticed her somber mood, reaching out to gently pat her head in a doting gesture of brotherly love. He told her not to take it to heart, for the king had always been an unpredictable monster. Arya pouted, her cheeks puffing out as she grumbled about how infuriating that man True was. Muriel just smiled, reminding her that being personally interviewed by the king was an honor in itself, even if it ended in a hasty exit. She threw her arms around him, feeling her spirits lift as they arrived at the lush, sun-drenched estate. Dr. David welcomed them with open arms, his scholarly home a paradise of knowledge and beauty. Arya looked around in awe, her green eyes wide as she took in the stunning gardens, but the peace was shattered when she spotted a mysterious figure standing near the horses, a man draped in a dark, regal cloak. Muriel hesitated, wondering if they should avoid the newcomer, but the stranger's presence was impossible to ignore. As the man adjusted his collar, Arya's heart stopped. Beneath the hood, the familiar sharp features of the king stared back. The very man she was trying to escape had followed her here, his presence as intimidating and godlike as ever. The silver moon hung high over the Earl of Devonshire's castle, casting a serene glow over the silent grounds. Deep within the stone walls, the air was anything but peaceful as Earl David bowed low, his voice trembling as he welcomed the unexpected royal guest. He offered to immediately shut down the estate and prepare everything for a grand welcome, his heart hammering against his ribs in the presence of such a formidable ruler. But the king had no patience for such trivialities. He was there for the city's top scholars who were hard at work on the new national textbooks. Earl David quickly confirmed that the wise men were gathered under his roof, his anxiety slightly easing as they spoke of the Public Education Act. He felt a surge of overwhelming pride, his hands clasped together in a silent prayer of gratitude, imagining how honored the scholars would be to know the king himself valued their work. However, the king's gaze remained like chips of emerald ice, warning the earl not to dare schedule his movements or try to manage his time. The king sat with a statuesque, intimidating grace that made the room feel small and the air feel thin. The poor earl could do nothing but wipe the cold sweat from his forehead and obey. As the king set off to wander the grounds alone, the earl was left to ponder the mystery of a monarch's unpredictable whims. The next morning arrived with a flurry of activity as servants bustled through the sun-drenched halls. When the earl inquired about the king's whereabouts, he was met with the news that his majesty had already gone hunting at the break of dawn. It was a frustrating puzzle, but the earl knew he simply had to play it by ear and wait for the king's next move. Meanwhile, in a much happier corner of the castle, the little protagonist Arya was busy indulging in a cake that tasted like a literal dream. She sat at a grand table with Muriel, surrounded by an abundance of treats that made her feel as though she had stepped into a slice of heaven. Her emerald eyes sparkled with joy as she savored every bite, wishing that life could always be the sweet and uncomplicated. The castle was a treasure trove of art and history, and she explored the lavish corridors with a sense of wonder before heading outside to watch her kite dance against the clouds. She was a whirlwind of energy, her laughter echoing as she ran through the estate, much to the amusement of the doting maids. But a sudden worry crossed her mind. She hadn't packed any dress grand enough for a place like this. Muriel, ever the handsome and talented brother, simply gave her a reassuring look and snapped his fingers. In a dazzling burst of magic and light, a beautiful bliss materialized around her, shimmering with a celestial glow. Arya watched in awe as the magical sparkles settled into the fine fabric of her new gown. Muriel modestly explained it was just a simple intermediate illusion, though it would only last for about 15 minutes. Even a second was enough. She felt like the most precious and cutest person in the entire castle as she twirled in her magical finery. Soon, it was time to get back to more serious matters, and she followed Muriel to the library where the scholars were deep in their work. The room was filled with a concentrated silence as they pieced together textbooks for the Elven Kingdom. Muriel looked godlike in his focus, his sharp fears illuminated by the soft fiery light as he reviewed the drafts. They discussed adding ancient Elvish and old ballads, debating how to make the transition from simple to complex learning. Earl David was stuck on a name for the collection, something official yet not too heavy-handed. Arya didn't hesitate to offer her input, suggesting they call it the standard textbook for compulsory education. She explained with an innocent but firm conviction that getting an education was a duty every citizen should fulfill. The Earl was momentarily stunned by the term compulsory, wondering why she would make learning sound like such a chore. But as she explained that mandatory education was the only way to ensure everyone got a fair shot at life, the Earl's confusion turned into deep admiration. He was moved to the point of tears, seeing his own life's ambition reflected in the words of such a small child. Muriel looked on with a proud smile as the room erupted into appreciative applause for the young girl's brilliance. But the celebratory mood was cut short by a sudden, booming announcement that the king had arrived. The heavy doors swung open to reveal the king's silhouette, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over the room. He looked colder and more dangerous than ever, but it was the sharp, metallic scent of blood clinging to him that hit Arya first. Her eyes widened and began to swirl with a deep-seated terror. She was deathly afraid of blood. The world began to tilt as Muriel called out her name in concern, but her strength failed her and she passed out right then and there. When she finally regained consciousness, she was tucked into a soft, luxurious bed. Her first thoughts were of Muriel and how on earth she had ended up in such a grand room. A group of maids quickly appeared by her side, relieved to see her awake. Arya nervously asked where she was, only to be told that the king himself had carried her here after her collapse. The king had returned from his hunt after bagging a massive, terrifying bear, and he had intended to dedicate the prize to the scholars. Arya could only imagine the horrific sight of the giant beast, her heart racing at the thought of the king's casual violence. Realizing she was in the very quarters where that jerk lived, she scrambled out of bed, desperate to get back to safety. After a quick change into a new dress, she rushed back toward the library, hoping to find brother. She found him, but Muriel was so deeply immersed in his work that he seemed to be practically glowing with focus. Not wanting to disturb his brilliant mind, she decided to slip away and head toward the lounge instead. She arrived as the king was entering, his voice cold as he commanded his attendants not to follow him. He looked tired and regal as he stepped into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. He sat down and poured himself a glass of wine, seemingly unaware of the small figure huddled on the other end of the couch. Arya sat there, stiff and terrified, her eyes wide as she tried to make herself as small as possible. The silence between the powerful tyrant and the trembling child was thick and suffocating. They were the only two in the entire castle with nothing to do, caught in a bizarre, awkward standoff. Suddenly, the heavy silence was broken by the loud, traitorous rumble of Arya's empty stomach. The king's sharp gaze shifted toward her, his expression unreadable. Arya looked longingly at the golden tier of cakes on the table, but they were frustratingly out of her reach. She hesitated, her heart pounding, but her hunger finally won out over her fear. She slowly approached the intimidating man, her small steps echoing in the quiet room. Summoning all her courage, she reached out and grabbed his tunic, looking up at him with those big, teary emerald eyes. The king was visibly puzzled, his cold facade flickering with genuine shock at her audacity. With a small, trembling voice, she pointed to the Black Forest cake and asked if he would please get it for her. She stood there, a tiny creature weaponizing her cuteness against the most dangerous man in the kingdom, all for the sake of a sweet treat. And the air in the grand hall was a suffocating pressure as the golden-haired tyrant sat motionless, his gaze colder than winter frost while he swirled a glass of blood-red wine. Yet little Arya didn't flinch, standing before him with a dignified air as she pointed out that she couldn't reach the treats, and he was the only grown-up around to help. To the utter shock of everyone present, the man whose hands were stained with the blood of many actually moved, his expression remaining like stone as he carefully served a chocolate cupcake to the tiny girl. Arya's face lit up with a delighted glow, her eyes sparkling like gems as she beamed at the small kindness. As Hing's mind flickered to a memory of a powerful, crowned woman holding a ruby-encrusted staff, yet this child was a world apart from that cold past. The sudden click of the door announced the arrival of his knight, who froze in sheer disbelief at the harmonious scene before him. Arya, shamelessly weaponizing her cuteness, chirped that she wanted a strawberry macaron next, oblivious to the knight's internal meltdown. With a sharp, terrifyingly precise motion, the king passed her the sweet, causing the knight to nearly collapse from the shock of seeing his majesty serve dessert to a child. But the moment of domestic peace was short-lived as the king's emerald eyes sharpened, signaling a return to the cold reality of his rule. He announced his departure, leaving Arya to watch his retreating back with a mix of curiosity and lingering fear. Behind him, The knight tried to marvel at how the girl held no grudges, but a murderous glare from the king quickly silenced him. She was just a child, the king insisted, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument even as he reached for a secret letter from the Ball Empire. Later, Arya solaced with her brother Muriel, who was drowning in guilt for not being by her side when she fainted. He complained bitterly about the king's lack of family values, his words bordering on rebellion as he served her dinner. Arya sat in a daze, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. She wanted to hate the father who had sent her away as a baby, yet his recent small gestures filled her with a confusing sense of happiness. To distract her, Muriel presented a gorgeous hat adorned with a silk flower, a gift that makes her eyes widen in awe. The garden was a paradise of fluttering petals and sunlight as Arya played in her new finery. Suddenly, a vibrant blue bird swooped from the sky, its sharp beak snatching the hat right from her head in a blur of feathers. She cried out in dismay, chasing the feathered thief as it chirped provocatively and vanished into the high branches of the forest. Deep in the woods, a mysterious young man stood perched on a thick limb, his eyes reflecting a hidden depth as the bird brought him the floral pin from the hat. He mused about whether the bird had found a pretty girl, his lips curling into a faint, intriguing smile. Arya, determined to get her treasure back, watched the bird from a window before dashing through the palace in a desperate pursuit. She scrambled down the grand stairs, her breath coming in short gasps as she reached for the bird, only to lose her balance and fall. Instead of hitting the ground, she bumped right into the king's departing convoy, finding herself under the intense gaze of the sovereign himself. The knight, ever the opportunist, asked if she wanted to ride back in the royal carriage, and Arya agreed with a sheepish blush, feeling like a fool for her wild chase. The interior of the carriage was a tomb of silence, the air heavy with the king's intimidating aura as he leaned back with a bored expression. He thought to himself that if she made even one sound, he would toss her out without a second thought, yet he made no move to push her away. Arya huddled in her seat, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety as her eyelids grew heavy. She drifted into a dream of her parents, calling out to them in a void of sparkling light and drifting petals. A hand reached out through the darkness and she grasped it with all her might, seeking warmth in the cold. When she stirred, she found the king watching her, his stern features softened by the dim light of the carriage. In a moment of rare, unspoken tenderness, he noticed her tiny hand reaching for his regal cloak and gently took it in his own, a silent vow of protection. The peace was shattered by a deafening boom that rocked the carriage, followed by the terrifying cry of assassins. Outside, the knights drew their swords in a desperate struggle to protect the king as blades clashed and horses reared in terror. Arya woke to a nightmare, her heart stopping as she saw a knight being brutally struck down right before her eyes. Before the horror could consume her, a large hand moved with lightning speed to cover her eyes, the king's voice a low, steady command for her not to look. As he held her close, a massive, glowing green serpent erupted from a magical spell, its fangs bared, glowing with a murderous light as it prepared to strike. The silence of the forest was shattered by a deafening roar as a colossal, emerald serpent lunged from the shadows, its crimson eyes burning with a murderous intent that froze the very air. Amidst the wreckage of splintered wood and the scent of iron-rich blood, the scene was a massacre, a terrifying display of power that left the royal escort in ruins. A blinding explosion of golden magic tore through the carnage, a testament to the arrival of a force far more dangerous than any beast. The attackers watched from the thickets, their cloaks fluttering as they urged their companions to flee before the true monster of the empire arrived. From above, the clearing looked like a graveyard of broken dreams, the white carriages standing out like tombstones against the lush greenery. Then he appeared. The emperor's golden hair shimmered like a halo, but there was no divinity in his, only a cold, suffocating pressure that demanded total submission. He looked upon the pathetic remnants of the ambush with a sneer of pure disdain, labeling them nothing more than wretched losers who dared to cross his path. His presence was statuesque and intimidating, a man who ruled through fear and absolute power. With a flick of his wrist, his elite mages materialized from the ether, their presence a silent promise of impending doom. The emperor didn't even break a sweat as he conjured a swirling orb of destructive magic, his voice a low, lethal purr as he commanded his men to wipe every single one of them out. The forest was consumed by a blinding, holy light, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. As the dust settled, a lone blue bird perched atop the carriage, chirping a mocking melody to the silence. The young guard approached the carriage with bated breath, his heart hammering as he asked if everyone was all right. Arya's small frame emerged, her face pale but her spirit intact, though she tried to act as if the horrific scene hadn't shaken her to her core. Her father had been prepared for anything the moment he received the prince's warning, but even top-notch mages couldn't erase the lingering fear in a child's eyes. The blue bird watched them with an unnerving intelligence, a silent witness to the trauma. Where was the little girl, the boy asked, his brow furrowed in concern as he searched for the small protagonist. He scratched his head in confusion, wondering where she could have vanished to in the chaos. Inside the velvet-lined sanctuary of the carriage, Arya was a trembling mess, her tiny hands clamped over her eyes as she tried to block out the world. The boy teased her for being such a little scaredy cat, promising her that the danger had passed and it was safe to look. But as she slowly lowered her hands, the sound of a child's voice reached her ears, pulling her back to the grim reality. Her green eyes widened in horror as her gaze landed on the crimson stains splattered across the ground. Blood. So much blood. The world began to spin, her vision blurring into a haze of red and shadow as a cold sweat broke out on her brow. With a soft gasp, her strength failed her, and she collapsed forward, her small body falling into the boy's startled embrace. He caught her in a panic, wondering what on earth had just happened to the spirited girl. It seemed Missy Arya had a secret weakness. The sight of blood was enough to send her into a dead faint. He looked down at her unconscious form, a flicker of something soft crossing his face as he realized how fragile she truly was. The journey finally ended at the gates of Weir's house, a sprawling estate that promised safety and warmth. The family stood waiting at the entrance, their hearts heavy with worry until the carriages finally appeared. The guards bid their farewells, heading back to report to the palace, while Arya waved them off with a grateful smile. Her family was already there, her mother's arms open wide and her brothers waiting with anxious faces. Arya threw herself into the warmth of her home, crying out that she was finally back. Her brother pulled her into a suffocating hug, weeping dramatically about how thin she'd gotten and how every second without her felt like an eternity. But even amidst the doting chaos, Arya couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Back in the quiet of the manor, she paced her room, her mind racing. She could have sworn she saw someone else during the attack, someone who didn't belong to the escort or the attackers. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine, a scent she knew all too well. Why did the air suddenly smell like dark magic? She turned around to find a mysterious boy standing right there, his eyes piercing through her with a dangerous intensity. He was the same boy from the forest, the one connected to the Emperor's shadow and the monstrous serpent. Arya looked at him with realization, the image of the Emperor and the snake flashing behind her eyes. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to peel back the layers of her soul. He warned her that anyone who discovered his secret would end up pushing up daisies, his voiced with a lethal edge. But Arya wasn't a normal child. She met his gaze with a mischievous smirk, her eyes sparkling with challenge as she teased him about his dark secret. The boy was stunned, his face flushing a deep crimson as he realized she was just teasing him. He stammered for her to back off, his intimidation crumbling under her playful laughter. She giggled, telling him they were even now since he'd teased her earlier. As she skipped away, the boy watched her, his heart racing with a confusing mix of irritation and intrigue. She was definitely different from any girl he'd ever met. He watched her retreating figure, his brow sweating from the sheer absurdity of the encounter. Meanwhile, the moon hung high over the royal palace, illuminating the king's private chambers. The emperor stood like a statuesque god as his maids meticulously dressed him in his royal regalia. The atmosphere was heavy with a suffocating silence as his aides reported the details of the upcoming banquet for the empire's special guests. When asked who would accompany him since the queen was unavailable, the emperor's gaze turned icy. He didn't need an escort. A king was a power unto himself, and he would show up alone if he had to. He turned his back to his attendants, his golden hair catching the light as he dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. But as he took the guest list into his hands, his eyes narrowed. He scanned the names until his gaze landed on a specific one, Arya Ware. Memories of the small girl flashed through his mind, the way he had protected her, the way she had looked at him with those big eyes. A plan began to form in his mind, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative tone as he mentioned Princess Grace. He walked away with a determined stride, his mind already set on the upcoming event. Back at her desk, Arya was struggling to write a letterreel, her face heating up as she tried to describe the insane events of her return. She groaned in frustration, slamming her head against the desk as she wondered if she should even mention the dark magic boy. A sudden thud against her window made her heart leap into her throat. She rushed to the glass, peeking out into the moonlit garden, but the trees were still and the air was empty. She looked down at the dark bushes, wondering if she had just imagined the noise. She sighed, thinking she must be overthinking things and letting her imagination run wild. But she was wrong. High above on a sturdy branch, the boy sat hidden by the leaves, dangling his legs as he watched her with a faint, mocking smile. He muttered about what a silly girl she was for not looking up, his only companion, a disgruntled blue bird that glared at him with disdain. He tried to act tough, telling the bird he wasn't a creep, he'd only come to apologize for making her faint the other day. But his courage failed him at the last second. He decided he would just wait until the banquet to speak to her properly, his gaze lingering on her window one last time. The music swells as the banquet begins, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the hushed excitement of the nobility. Arya stands in the center of the ballroom, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes as the crowd whispers about the mysterious child who is granted such unprecedented VIP treatment. Even the servants seem to treat her with a reverence usually reserved for high royal, fueling rumors that she might be an imperial secret from the Ball Empire. The suffocating pressure of the gossip makes her heart hammer against her ribs, but she remains frozen as the herald announces the arrival of the emperor. The grand doors swing open, revealing the statuesque emperor walking alongside his favored concubine, Lady Rose, while the tiny Princess Grace trails behind clutching a stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. The room erupts in a low chatter of scandal. with many wondering why the emperor would dare bring a concubine to such an event in place of the queen. The air grows cold as the truth circulates through the hall. Has supposedly abandoned her throne to lock herself away in the Tower of God. A vision of the beautiful, tragic queen flashes through Arya's mind, and a sudden, chilling realization strikes her heart. The crowd scoffs, claiming the queen's sacrifice was for the young prince's blessing, but Arya knows the wretched truth. A single hot tear escapes her eye as she realizes the queen didn't do it for any prince. She sacrificed her freedom solely to protect Arya. Amidst the tension, the emperor's nominal daughter, Grace, shamelessly seeks his attention, begging perform a dance for his amusement to secure her place by his side. As the girl twirls like a delicate doll for the emperor's favor, Arya feels a crushing sense of isolation and dread for what the future holds. She tries to shrink into the shadows, her hands trembling, when a presence cuts through her despair. It's a handsome young boy who greets her with an infuriatingly familiar smile, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Arya is eyed in shock as she wonders how he could possibly know her name. But the boy's face quickly flushes with indignation. He snaps that she was practically breathing down the last time they met, and finds it insulting that she has already forgotten him. He gazes at her with a mix of frustration and a strange, lingering intensity that makes her pulse quicken. He asks if she's simply jealous of the princess basking in the limelight of the ballroom. Arya meets his gaze, her expression turning cold and distant. She thinks to herself that being a princess in her world was never a dream, but a gilded cage. The boy mumbles something under his breath, his cheeks turning a rosy pink as he suggests she should just return with him to his kingdom. He begins to introduce himself as Andy, his voice filled with a strange urgency as he reaches out a hand. But before he can finish his introduction, a servant summons him away, his royal duties calling him back to the emperor's side. He looks back one last time, promising to return and telling her to wait for him no matter what. Arya is left in a daze, questioning if they truly shared a history she has somehow lost. Across the hall, the crowd continues to marvel at the little prince from the Ball Empire, noting how adorable he appears. The emperor nods in approval, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if searching for a missing piece of a puzzle. His aides notice his distraction, asking what has caught his imperial gaze amidst the sea of nobles. He admits he's looking for playmates for the children, though his tone suggests his interest is far more calculated. When a servant suggests inviting Arya to join the royal children, the emperor silences him with a murderous glare that could freeze the very blood in one's veins. The scene shifts to the masquerade ball, where identities are hidden behind gilded masks and the atmosphere turns enchanting. In this world of shadows and silk, even the children are allowed to cast aside their titles for a moment of fun. Arya wanders the floor, her mind consumed by the queen's fate and the mystery of how to enter the Forbidden Tower. Suddenly, she collides with someone, the impact nearly sending her to the floor. It's Princess Grace, whose eyes flare with instant, venomous rage behind her ornate mask. The spoiled princess demands an apology, suggesting that Arya strip off her fine clothes and dress as a servant so Grace can escape her own duties. Arya stares at her with a cold, piercing gaze, stunned by the girl's sheer audacity and lack of grace. Grace continues her wretched tantrum, acting as if she owns the very air they breathe. But Arya isn't the same girl she used to be. She retorts with a sharp tongue, suggesting Grace would look much better in the queen's prison-like robes. The two girls glare at each other, the air between them crackling with a murderous aura. Just as the situation is about to explode into a scene, Andy reappears holding a beautiful garland of purple flowers. He approaches with a bright smile, clearly intending to crown his special guest with the gift. Grace, blinded by her own vanity, assumes the gift is for her and steps forward with a smug, triumphant grin. She shamelessly pushes past Arya, her eyes sparkling with greed as she prepares to be honored. She demands the flowers, certain that the prince is mesmerized by her royal status. She blushes deeply, waiting for the moment of public adoration. But Andy simply looks at her with a face full of utter confusion and disdain, his voice dripping with cold indifference as he asks her who she is and why she is bothering him. She delicately lifted the mask from her face, her features softening into a mask of calculated innocence. With her lower lip trembling and eyes brimming with unshed tears, she pleaded for a simple garland, knowing exactly how to tug at his heartstrings. Her wide violet eyes were a trap of pure moisture, designed even the coldest heart melt. Poor, naive Andy was no match for her performance. He backed away in a flustered panic, unable to handle the sight of her distress. Arya watched him with a hidden, mischievous glint. What a fool he was to fall for such a simple act. Finally, he relented, tossing the floral crown toward her while she feigned indifference, claiming she didn't even want the silly thing in the first place. She wore the garland with a haughty air, her internal sassy bird chirping in triumph as she successfully manipulated the situation. But the playful mood shifted as Grace stood by, her expression clouded with a dark, suffocating unease. Suddenly, the air grew tense as Andy noticed something amiss and rushed off into the shadows. Before Arya could follow, he snatched her wrist, his grip firm as he tried to keep her away from the brewing danger. He didn't want her involved in whatever darkness was lurking, so he offered her a shimmering golden bracelet instead, hoping to distract her. Arya stared at the precious gift, her heart skipping a beat in genuine shock. Nearby, the atmosphere turned icy as Grace stood trembling, her body racked with a fear she couldn't voice. The poor girl's hands were raw, blood staining her delicate skin where she had been hurt. When her mother approached, the woman's gaze was sharper than a blade, demanding to know what had transpired. Grace looked utterly pitiful, a broken doll in a sea of finery. The sight of the scratches on her daughter's arm turned the mother's blood cold, her eyes flashing with a murderous intent to whoever had dared to touch her child. As they moved through the gala, the tension was palpable, yet Andy remained focused on Arya, his fingers brushing against hers as he fastened the bracelet. He was such a grumpy little creature, masking his concern with a sharp tongue as he told her to just take it or he'd throw it away. Arya could only wonder how old this little tyrant really was, given his arrogant attitude. Her thoughts were interrupted by a man who claimed a guest was waiting for her in the gardens. Trustingly, she followed him into the moonlight, only for the trap to spring shut as he grabbed her with a terrifying strength. Panic surged through her as he muffled her screams, his hand like a vice over her mouth. She had to fight back. She wouldn't let it end like this. Summoning every ounce of her will, she prepared to unleash her magic. A sudden explosion of fire lit up the night as Andy appeared, his hands wreathed in a brilliant, scorching flame. The man, a grotesque human puppet, recoiled and Sharia broke free from his grasp. The monster snarled, his eyes void of humanity, as he vowed to teach the meddlesome brat a lesson. Magic crackled in the air, a violent symphony of light and shadow. Arya braced herself for the impact, certain that her end was near. But the blow never came. Instead, Andy threw himself in front of her, taking the full force of the attack. Blood sprayed across his fine clothes as he collapsed, yet his first instinct was to check if she was safe. He was bleeding, his shoulder torn open, yet he commanded her to stay back with a voice that brooked no argument. The puppet man approached again, his presence a suffocating pressure of dark arts. Andy recognized the forbidden magic of the Ball Empire, his eyes narrowing as he realized the true gravity of the situation. With a roar of power, he unleashed a wave of magic that sent the monster reeling in agony. The creature turned and fled into the darkness, with Andy hot on its heels, leaving Arya alone and trembling. She rushed back to the palace, her voice high and frantic as she tried to warn the others of the danger. But the adults looked at her with disdain, dismissing her claims of monsters as the mere ramblings of a child. Her mother's face was a mask of cold fury, embarrassed by her daughter's supposed nonsense. Arya felt a crushing weight of despair. No one believed her, and Andy was still out there in peril. Then, the Emperor arrived, his presence commanding the room as he looked down at the small, shaking girl. In a rare moment of tenderness, the statuesque ruler picked her up, his gaze searching hers as he asked what she had truly seen. Feeling the warmth of his protection, she spilled the truth about the human puppet and the direction they had fled. The palace was instantly thrown into a frenzy as guards were dispatched to search the grounds. Arya sat among the royals, her heart heavy with worry as they discussed the forbidden magic that had infiltrated their walls. The situation was far more complicated than they had imagined, a web of political intrigue and dark spells. Finally, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Andy. Relief washed over Arya like a tidal wave as she ran to him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. But as she reached out to touch him, he pulled away with a chilling coldness, his voice sharp as a shard of ice as he told her to never touch him again. The glint of the golden bracelet caught the boy's eye, sparking a fire of pure, unadulterated rage within his heart. How could a lowly girl like her possess something so precious, a treasure that belonged only to him? His accusations cut through the air like a blade, demanding to know where she had gotten that bracelet, and if she had dared to steal the sacred heirloom. Without a shred of hesitation, he snatched her wrist with a harsh grip, his eyes burning with a murderous aura as he accused the little thief of her crimes. The atmosphere turned frigid as he looked down at her, declaring that he would never let this go and that she should just wait and see what was coming for her. He turned his back on her, his departure punctuated by a cold warning that he would deal with her later. Left alone in the vast, echoing hallway, the girl's blood boiled with indignation. She wasn't some common thief, and she certainly wouldn't take this disrespect lying down. With a frustrated growl, she threw a handful of snacks at his retreating figure, her small fists clenching in a silent vow to drive that arrogant brat absolutely insane. She stomped through the palace, her heart heavy with the injustice of it all, vowing that she would never give the treasure back. Picking up the remnants of her pride, she wandered deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors until she realized she was completely lost. Suddenly, the sound of someone else approaching made her freeze, the rhythmic tap of boots signaling new presence. A young boy staggered into view, his presence radiating an aura of royal entitlement that immediately set her on edge. This was Prince Lucian, the first son of the Elven Queen, a boy whose very existence felt like a personal insult to her soul. As he grabbed her, demanding to know what a stranger was doing in his domain, a flash of memory pierced through her, a vision of a baby who had taken everything from her, the one who had stolen her rightful place. The resentment she had buried deep inside flared to life as she realized this was the boy who lived the life that should have been hers. Lucian was relentless, pulling her hair and sneering that no one spoke to him with such defiance unless they had a death wish. He lunged for her, his face twisted in a mask of fury. But she wasn't the same helpless child he thought she was. With a sharp cry of protest, she pounced on him, determined to make him pay for everything he had taken. "You stole my mother," she screamed in her heart, her hands flying as they tumbled into a chaotic, dusty brawl on the royal carpet. They rolled around like wild kittens, neither willing to back down, as she clawed and bit at the prince who had dared to be a jerk to her. The struggle was intense, a whirlwind of limbs and anger, as she refused to let him win. Lucian pinned her down with a fierce expression, but her spirit remained unbroken despite his overwhelming strength. The scuffle was brought to a screeching halt when the palace maids rushed in, their faces pale with horror at the sight of the young prince being pinned down. Behind them stood Lady Rose, whose eyes narrowed with malicious delight at the scene. She didn't hesitate to escalate the situation, declaring that harming the heir to the throne was a capital crime that would cost the girl her head. The guards swarmed her, their heavy hands dragging her away as she struggled against the suffocating pressure of their grip. Lady Rose watched with a sickening smirk, whispering that the annoying little bug was finally toast and ordering her out of her sight forever. The girl was dragged before the highest authority, her fate hanging by a thread as she was brought toward the council hall. Inside, the air was thick with political tension as the king discussed the encroaching shadows of the Ball Empire and the whispers of traitors within their midst. The king's gaze was steely, his focus entirely on the safety of his realm, completely unaware of the small drama unfolding outside his doors. With a wave of his hand, he ordered the activation of a powerful magic formation, the air crackling with blue energy as ancient runes began to glow. A swirling vortex of light appeared, and from the shimmering portal stepped a man of undeniable power and grace. Elias, the crown prince of the Ball Empire, arrived with a confident smirk, his presence commanding the room instantly. He greeted the Elven king with a practiced charm, though his words held a sharp edge when he spoke of his disappointing son causing trouble. He looked at the young prince with a mixture of amusement and disdain, calling him a little rascal who was practically on death's door. In the corner of the hall, Lady Rose put on a performance worthy of an award, weeping crocodility about her supposed negligence and begging for death because the prince had been hurt. Lucian, sporting a bandage on his face, pointed a trembling finger at the girl, lying through his teeth that she had attacked him when he wasn't looking. The girl stood tall, her green eyes flashing with a dignified fire as she shot back that he was the one who pulled her hair first. Lucian sneered, reminding her that under Elven law, she was looking at an execution for laying a hand on royalty. But she didn't flinch, instead looking him straight in the eye and telling him he didn't deserve to be the queen's child while she was suffering in solitude. The room fell into a stunned silence as she called him petty and declared he would never earn a shred of respect even if he became king. The tension was broken by a sudden, sharp laugh from Elias, who looked at the girl with newfound intrigue. He found her spirit refreshing, noting that not all elven women were delicate flowers and that this one had some serious spunk. Since the elven laws demanded her death, he made a shocking proposal that sent ripples through the court. Why not just let him take her back and make her a woman of the Ball Empire instead? The air in the grand hall turned ice-cold as a single, outrageous word echoed the silence. What? Faces paled and breaths hitched as the weight of the moment settled over the room, the shock of the proposal leaving everyone breathless. Even little Arya could feel the suffocating pressure of the gaze fixed upon her, realizing her fate was being bargained away like a common trinket while she stood right there. The man behind the madness was none other than the legendary Prince Elias of the Ball Empire, who casually suggested that the little one should become his daughter-in-law. It was a golden opportunity, a marriage alliance that could transform a mere child into a hero of the Elven Kingdom, sealing the bond between two great powers for generations to come. The room was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the terrifying sparkle of high-stakes politics as Arya's future was painted in shades of gold and blue. But the prince was met with sharp rebukes from his companions, who warned him not to go spouting off such nonsense just because they were friends. Elias simply brushed it off with a playful smirk, his handsome features glowing with a dangerous, godlike charm as he waved off the tension with a lighthearted gesture. The revelation sent a crackle of shock through the onlookers. Could this man truly be the crown prince of the Ball Empire? And was he truly serious about such a bold claim? He offered a playful wink, a gesture so casual it was almost insulting given the political chaos he had just unleashed with a single sentence. Arya felt like a ghost in her own life, silently while powerful men decided her entire destiny as if she weren't even in the room. Is this what it felt like when power called the shots, leaving her small and helpless of an empire's whims? Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked toward the shadows, her emerald eyes meeting a pair of familiar, intense ones that seemed to pierce right through her. Was marrying into the Ball Empire truly her only way out of this wretched mess, or was she just trading one gilded cage for another? The boy in the shadows, her secret protector, could only offer a fleeting, pained gaze before turning away to avoid discovery by the prying eyes of the court. He clutched his chest, his face flushing with a mix of shame and desperation as he vanished into the corridors, unable to bear the weight of her stare. Later, within the quiet sanctuary of the palace, the air remained heavy with secrets as the prince and his companion discussed the grim reality of their situation. Elias looked out the window, his expression uncharacteristically somber as he admitted that even a crown prince wasn't actually the one calling the shots in his own home. His father was old and easily swayed by the vultures serving as his advisors, and the Ball Empire was currently a complete mess, torn apart by internal rebellion. With a clenched fist and a gaze that burned with hidden fire, Elias that a marriage alliance was the only legitimate way to keep the children safe from the unpredictable chaos back home. It was a desperate gamble for safety, a long-haul plan to ensure their survival until the throne was finally secure and the internal chaos sorted. He teased his young companion, asking why he would pick a commoner when there were so many princesses, knowing full well the boy's heart was already spoken for. Cyrus tried to remain stoic, his handsome face a mask of indifference, even as the prince caught him sneaking glances at the claimed not to care about. But the time for talk was over. News of a dangerous enemy had finally reached them, shifting the atmosphere once again. Outside, a blue bird took flight, soaring over the city like a herald of the coming storm, its wings catching the light. A hooded figure moved through the crowded streets, following the bird's path with a sense of urgent purpose that felt out of place in the peaceful afternoon. The city was bustling, unaware of the drama unfolding in the shadows as the boy tracked his target through the sun-drenched squares and winding alleys. Arya, meanwhile, was finally returning to the safety of Weir's home, the carriage wheels clicking against the cobblestones as gossip about her future as an empress spread like wildfire through the streets. She stepped out into a garden of roses, the familiar scent of home wrapping around her like a warm embrace after her long ordeal. Yet, a shiver ran down her spine. She felt a gaze on her, a presence lurking just beyond the bushes, though she tried to dismiss it as her imagination. Her family rushed to meet her, their faces lighting up with pure joy as they pulled her into a tearful, loving hug. She was back, safe for now, nestled in the arms of those who truly loved her and called her their darling. From the shadows, the hooded boy watched the tender scene, his heart heavy with a relief he couldn't express aloud to anyone. His wise blue bird perched on his shoulder, the only witness to his silent vigil as he watched over the girl from a distance. But the peace of the night was short-lived. Back in her room, Arya moved through the darkness with a single candle, only for the flame to be suddenly extinguished by an invisible hand. A hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her scream before it could even begin, the candle clattering to the floor in the sudden struggle. Fear seized her heart, her eyes widening in the dim light as she realized someone had broken into her sanctuary in the dead of night. It was him, who had risked everything. He whispered for her to be quiet, his voice strained and weak as he leaned against her for support. He was a mess, staggering as if the very act of standing was a battle, his hand pressed firmly against his chest where the pain seemed centered. Arya's melted into a cold, suffocating dread as she saw him tremble, his strength failing him despite his attempts to look strong. She remembered how he had put his life on the line for her, fighting like a monster to ensure her safety while she was whisked away. Was he hurt that badly back then, and had he been hiding his wounds this entire time? He tried to play it off his usual cocky attitude, claiming he was still full of energy even as his pale face and shaking hands told a different story. He had spotted the secret arts of the Ball Empire and realized the caliber of the monsters they were facing was far beyond what he expected. Despite the danger, his stomach betrayed him with a loud growl, and Arya couldn't help but feel a pang of pity as he shamelessly asked for something to eat. She brought him a tray of food, watching in silence as he wolfed it down like a starving animal, his desperation clear in every bite. Between bites, he pleaded with her to help him reach the king or find a carriage, his voice muffled by the bread he was devouring. Arya suggested asking where for help, but the boy stopped her immediately, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity. He couldn't trust anyone else. His location had to remain a secret in this world of shifting loyalties and hidden agendas. "I only trust you, Arya," he confessed, his gaze softening for a fleeting second as he looked at her with a sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. But the moment was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps outside the door, the unmistakable tap of someone approaching. Someone was coming. Arya's heart leapt into her throat as the door clicked open, and she instinctively gripped her dress, her knuckles white with tension as she faced the unknown intruder. Avery's world shattered when he found a strange boy in his sister's room, his heart stopping at the sight of the intruder. Shocked and protective, he demanded to know who this stranger was, barking at Arya to get away from the boy immediately. How could she be so reckless as to bring a random person home? He was going to tell their parents everything, certain that Arya was in massive trouble. But the boy wasn't just some commoner. He moved with the grace of a predator, suddenly grabbing Avery and calling him a loudmouth. With a gaze that could freeze blood, he loomed over Avery, asking exactly who he thought he was going to tell. Suddenly, a suffocating pressure filled the room, the unmistakable chilling vibe of dark magic that felt like a physical weight. Avery was paralyzed, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized Arya had somehow gotten tangled up with someone truly dangerous. Arya's voice trembled as she pleaded for mercy, begging Andy not to hurt her brother. Andy sneered, mocking the lack of loyalty among elves before finally releasing his grip. He warned Avery that if he had any brains at all, he would keep his mouth shut. The sheer intensity of the power left Avery collapsing to the floor, trembling and convinced he was facing a literal freak of nature. Unable to handle the terror a second longer, Avery fled the room, screaming in a blind panic. Left alone, the mysterious coughed, the strain of using such immense power taking its toll on his body. He knew he couldn't stay, yet as he prepared to vanish, he looked at Arya with a flicker of regret, worried he had messed things up for her. With a final agile leap, he disappeared through the window, leaving Arya calling out to him in the night. Back in the safety of his own room, Avery tried to focus on his books, but the boy's image haunted him. Then, the realization hit him like a lightning bolt as he looked at the pages. That boy was royalty from the Ball Empire. Panic seized him. He had to warn their parents before it was too late. He sprinted through the halls, his footsteps echoing like frantic drumbeats as he reached his father's study. He threw open the doors with a desperate cry, announcing that Arya had brought a stranger home. But instead of the chaos he expected, he was met with a deafening silence. There, sitting perfectly composed and sipping tea with his father, was the very boy he feared. Andy offered a playful, mocking wink, his charming smile masking the dangerous power hidden beneath. Arya beamed, shamelessly playing the part of the perfect hostess and inviting her brother to join their little tea party, acting as if nothing was wrong. It turned out that last night, Andy had decided to trust Arya's words about her family. He had approached Baron Ware with a regal air, introducing himself formally as Andy Noel Cilliar. He sought the Baron's help to contact the royal palace, revealing his high-stakes mission. The Baron, recognizing the gravity of dealing with the Ball Empire, agreed to facilitate the secret correspondence right away, as the official seal was stamped on the letter. The Baron handed it over, fully committed to helping the young royal. Andy casually mentioned his injury was the result of dark magic, a revelation that Maria's heart ached with guilt as she looked at him. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of Anar, who looked at the new boy with suspicion. Anar looked like he was about to cry, feeling replaced in Arya's affections. Arya tried to bridge the gap, introducing Andy as her good friend with a bright smile. The air crackled with tension as the two boys sized each other up during a confident handshake. The Baron was simply happy that Arya had found such a great friend to help her. Andy's ambitions didn't stop at tea. He boldly asked if Arya could return to the Ball Empire with him, leaving the Baron stunned. But before an answer could be given, a carriage arrived bearing a familiar face. Muriel was back. Arya's eyes sparkled with joy as she ran to greet him, throwing herself into a warm embrace. She had missed him like crazy. As Muriel held her, his protective gaze shifted. The warmth vanished from his eyes as they landed on Andy, turning cold and dismissive. A new, even more suffocating pressure filled the room as Muriel stared down the intruder, a silent war beginning over the girl caught in the middle. In the warmth of the living room, the statuesque Muriel looked down at Arya with a gaze full of doting affection, their conversation flowing easily about the brilliant Dark David and the future of compulsory education. Arya's eyes sparkled like emeralds as she championed the idea that true education only begins when it becomes a right for everyone, her voice filled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Nearby, Andy watched her in a daze, his heart skipping a beat as he struggled to reconcile this brilliant girl with the delicate flower he first met. At first, he had simply found her cute. But seeing her lost and frustrated had ignited a fierce, suffocating urge to protect her within his chest. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him as she discussed deep, complex topics with her nearly grown brother, topics that he could barely even wrap his head around. Arya suddenly turned her radiant smile toward him, snapping him reality as she inquired about the schools in his distant Ball Empire. She leaned in close, her expression mischievous as she eased him, wondering if he had been a total whiz kid or perhaps just a common slacker. Andy's face flushed a deep crimson, his pride wounded as he cried out against the accusation of being a slacker, while merely laughed and patted his head, advising him to hit the books once the new city schools were running. The atmosphere shifted when Muriel formally introduced the boy, acknowledging how he had bailed Arya out during a difficult time at the palace. Muriel's blue eyes narrowed with a sudden, sharp intensity as he sensed a dark magic vibe emanating from the youth, a chilling aura that made him wary of the boy's intentions. Andy quickly defended himself, his voice trembling with indignation as he explained that the dark energy was merely the lingering trace of an attack he had suffered. Muriel's knowledge was vast, and he spoke of the brewing rebellion in the Ball Empire and how King Cyrus sought to seal a friendship between their nations through this young visitor. Suddenly, a massive, shimmering wave of detection magic washed over the entire estate. A spell so vast and powerful it could only belong to Nicholas, the prime priest. The air grew heavy with a suffocating pressure as the priest appeared with a hauntingly beautiful smile, informing the young prince that it was time to return to the palace. Arya watched with a heavy heart and trembling hands as Andy was led away to a grand, white carriage, her mind filled with worry for the boy who had become her unexpected ally. Once the dust settled, Muriel dropped a bombshell that left Arya breathless. The Ball Empire was seeking a marriage alliance, and she was the one Prince Elias had personally chosen. Arya felt the weight of the world on her shoulders as she realized she was being used as a political chess piece to settle internal unrest in a foreign land. Muriel's voice was thick with sympathy as he worried about her living in a strange country, promising to talk to the king to shut down this ridiculous arrangement. However, Arya's gaze turned distant and determined. She knew that escaping the Elven Kingdom was her only hope, for if her secret ever came to light, it would mean an immediate death sentence. When Muriel playfully teased her about whether she actually liked Andy, Arya's face exploded in a frantic blush as she retreated in sheer embarrassment, her heart racing at the very thought. Meanwhile, far away at the royal palace, Andy's eyes burned with a fiery defiance as he shouted his refusal, vowing that he would never, in a million years, agree to such a marriage. The tension in the Ball Empire was suffocating as the young Prince Andy voiced his absolute disdain for the proposed marriage alliance with the Elven Kingdom. To him, being forced to marry a mere elven princess felt like the Empire had reached a pathetic new low, a sentiment he barked out with all the fire of a cornered lion. He felt as though he were being sold off like common merchandise, his pride wounded by the political games of his elders. But his father, Crown Prince Elias, possessed a gaze that could freeze a man's blood, reminding the boy that dark puppet magic was afoot, and this alliance was his only hope of survival until the rebellion was crushed. Why should he be the sacrifice, Andy wondered, when he could simply shove the burden onto identical twin brother Elvin? It was a secret that could shake the very foundations of the Empire. Elias had not one heir, but two, a pair of identical twins from a world that wanted them dead, because they were born under the shadow of a dark curse. They had spent their lives masquerading as a single person, a desperate ploy to ensure at least one of them reached adulthood in the treacherous Ball royal family. Even as infants, the weight of their lineage was a heavy crown, with invisible daggers always aimed at their tiny, innocent hearts. To the public, there was only one crown prince, a solitary figure standing amidst the glittering, cold halls of the palace. Back in the present, the brothers' squabble was anything but royal, with Elvin demanding to know what he would gain from such a bothersome marriage. If he was to take the fall, he wanted a price, perhaps making his brother his personal servant, or rather, his personal dog, just to satisfy his own petty whims. Their father's patience finally snapped, his voice booming through the chamber as he demanded they act like the princes they were born to be instead of fighting like common street urchins. Despite the thunderous rebuke, Andy remained defiant, his heart set against a union he never asked for. Meanwhile, in the sun-drenched halls of the Elven Kingdom, a different kind of drama was unfolding. King Stephen Ware stood before his subjects, his golden hair shimmering as he prepared to deliver news that would change the course of history. The air was thick with anticipation as he addressed the noble Ware family, acknowledging their ancient bloodline before dropping a bombshell that left everyone breathless. Crown Prince Elias of the Ball Empire had set his sights on their precious daughter, Arya, demanding her hand in marriage for his own son. The room spun for Arya's parents, their faces pale with a mix of shock and terror at the thought of sending their little girl to a foreign land so far away. Stephen looked at his daughter, his heart aching with a father's protective instinct, seeing her small hand trembling as she clung to him. He couldn't do it. She was too young, too fragile to be thrown into the vipers of a distant empire. Even as the king watched Arya's reflection in his eyes, seeing the quiet strength beneath her innocent facade, he considered rejecting the proposal to save her from such a fate. But Arya wasn't the helpless child they believed her to be. She remembered the warmth of her father's love, the sweet taste of cake, and the simple joys of her childhood. She knew that staying meant facing a horrible end. She had already glimpsed in her nightmares. This marriage wasn't a prison, it was an escape, a chance to rewrite a destiny written in blood and tears. With a resolve that left her parents stunned, she looked up with sparkling eyes and declared her willingness to go, masking her own desperation as a noble sacrifice for peace. As the family made their exit from the palace, a pair of watchful eyes followed them from the shadows of the grand staircase. The twins were at it again, their rivalry simmering just beneath the surface as they watched their future bride walk away. Did she even know the truth, they wondered? Was she just another pawn in a game she didn't understand? Rumors spread through the city like wildfire, whispers of a new princess and a powerhouse alliance that would change everything. The common folk couldn't help but wonder what was so special about this girl, watching as she walked through the streets with a grace that seemed beyond her years. Her father's hand on her head was a bittersweet comfort, a silent promise of protection even as he prepared to let her go. Arya offered a small, sad smile, trying to reassure him even as a cold chill settled in her bones. But the weight of their secret was a heavy burden. If the truth of her identity ever came to light, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be treason, a crime punishable by death. Deep in the night, Arya sought out her father, her heart heavy with the unspoken fears of a girl about to become a queen. She asked if he was worried about her etiquette, or if he feared she would crumble under the suffocating pressure of the Ball Empire. She admitted her own terror, the fear of not being good enough, of failing the people who loved her. But she refused to run away. She wanted to be someone impressive, a daughter they could truly be proud of, a woman who stood tall against the storm. Her father looked at her, his eyes welling with tears as he realized his little girl had grown up far too fast. He knew she couldn't hide forever, and perhaps this path, dangerous it was her only way to find justice for her mother and herself. She hugged him tight, a final moment of childhood innocence before the crown was placed upon her head. She told him not to worry, that Elias had been kind to her and would surely protect her in the days to come. The day of the coronation arrived with all the pomp and splendor befitting a future empress. Surrounded by the elite of the kingdom, Arya stood before the king, her heart pounding against her ribs as the golden crown was lowered onto her brow. She was no longer just a daughter. She was Princess Arya, the beacon of hope for a century of peace. The grand meeting ceremony followed, a spectacle of flowers and finery, where she was to be officially engaged to the grandson of the Ball King. The guests waited with bated breath, the air thick with the scent of roses and the hum of gossip. But as the minutes turned into hours, the excitement soured into confusion and then into a stinging insult. The groom was nowhere to be found. To the utter shock of the entire assembly, the prince had vanished, ditching his own engagement ceremony and leaving the new princess standing alone at the altar. The whispers turned into a roar of disbelief. Had he really just run off, leaving Arya to face the humiliation of a lifetime in front of the world? The air in the grand hall was thick with the suffocating pressure of 1,000 judgmental eyes, each whisper a jagged blade cutting into her spirit. Clenching her trembling hands against the fine fabric of her gown, Arya could feel the weight of the gossip crushing her, making her feel like a discarded doll in a den of wolves. Her heart pounded as the voices grew louder, mocking the girl who'd been abandoned at her own engagement ceremony. In the distance, the memory of Prince Andy flickered like a cruel joke. A boy who treated a royal engagement as nothing more than a fence to be climbed and escaped from. He laughed with such reckless abandon, so utterly clueless about the girl he was leaving behind to face the firing squad of high society. To him, this was a game, a way to drive his brother mad with his antics, never once considering the girl whose life was being derailed by his selfishness. The banquet hall became a cavern of shadows where the red eyes of the nobility feasted on her humiliation, their voices blending into a cacophony of malice. They whispered that the Ball Empire had broke a deal, mocking the king who had been so thoroughly disgraced by a mere boy's whim. Arya felt the world tilting as she realized the bitter truth. Andy didn't just mind her, he simply didn't want her at all. If she couldn't secure this alliance, she would be swallowed whole by the political gears of this wretched world. Perhaps meaty end at the edge of a cold blade. Suddenly, the crowd parted like the sea before a storm as a familiar, intimidating figure marched forward. It was King Cyrus, and his golden crown shimmered under the chandeliers, though his expression was more terrifying than any executioner's mask. Every step he took radiated a murderous aura that silenced the room, his eyes burning with a fury that promised destruction to anyone in his path. Arya's heart nearly stopped as he loomed over her, his presence so massive and cold that she could barely breathe. But then, instead of a reprimand, his large hand reached out, not to strike but to claim. With a suddenness that left her gasping, he swept her up into his arms, lifting her small frame as if she were the most precious treasure in his kingdom. His gaze was fixed on the cowards before him, his voice booming with a rage that demanded to know if the Silliers thought his elven kingdom was some plaything to be insulted. The other king scrambled forward, his face a mask of pathetic excuses, claiming his son was merely ill, but Cyrus's eyes didn't soften for a second. Arya looked up at the man holding her, her mind racing in a blur of confusion. Was this tyrant actually speaking up for her? For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into him, calling him father with a voice that shook, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson despite her better judgment. Even as the other king tried to play the role of a doting father-in-law, his presence felt greasy and wrong, prompting Arya to instinctively snuggle closer to Cyrus's broad chest. Cyrus didn't flinch, he simply stared down his rival, warning that if this mess wasn't handled properly, he was washing his hands of the entire alliance. Meanwhile, at the retreat palace, chaos reigned as the frantic search for the runaway princes continued, the air filled with the desperate cries of a father losing his grip. The king's temper flared as he realized both his sons had vanished, leaving him to face the wrath of the elven kingdom alone. High above on the roof, the elusive Prince Andy sat hidden behind the magic of an invisibility ring, smug watching the turmoil he had created. He didn't care about the princess or the political fallout, he only cared about escaping his brother's shadow and the shackles of a forced marriage. Back in the stillness of the royal office, the tension was a physical weight as Cyrus sat regally, sipping tea while looking down at the wretched man before him. He wasn't about to let his daughter be stuck in a half-hearted engagement, a mere footnote in a failed treaty. His voice was a cold blade as he declared the terms non-negotiable, refusing to let them walk all over the girl he had claimed as his own. Arya watched him from the sidelines, her green eyes wide with a mix of wonder and disbelief. Why was he acting like he actually cared about her? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to convince herself it was just a political move. Yet the warmth of his protection was impossible to ignore. Soon, she found herself whisked away to a bedroom that looked like something out of a fairy tale, filled with sparkling gems and dresses that shimmered like the morning dew. The maids chirped about her new status as the 7th princess, their hands moving frantically to prepare her for a life of luxury and court etiquette. Standing there in her new emerald gown, Arya looked into the mirror, her tiny face reflecting a future she never expected. A life within the royal palace, guard a king who might just be the father she always needed. And then Arya was thrust into the suffocating world of high society, forced to endure the rigid gaze of the strict Countess Miller, who had been tasked with molding her into a proper lady. Every movement had to be precise, her heart hammering against her ribs as she practiced the perfect bow over and over again, desperate to avoid a single mistake. When the moment finally came to stand before the throne, her voice trembled as she paid her respects to the one man who held her life in his hands. King Cyrus sat before her, a statue of cold perfection, radiating an aura of aloofness that made the very air in the room feel heavy and thin. He had no time for useless formalities, and with a flick of his wrist, he handed Arya over to Lady Rose, declaring that the child was now her responsibility. The palace was a place of iron hierarchy, and he bluntly informed the stunned concubine that raising one more child certainly wouldn't kill her. Lady Rose's face pale with shock, her mind racing as she realized she had been demoted to a mere babysitter, wondering what kind of game this little girl was playing to catch the king's eye. But the tyrant's word was absolute, and he officially decreed that Lady Rose would serve as Arya's new mother figure. Arya could only stare in a daze, her mind reeling at the sheer absurdity of being claimed by a woman who clearly despised her existence. The tension broke in the most unexpected way when Cyrus leaned down with a rare, gentle expression, offering a display of fatherly love that left Lady Rose absolutely blinded with a mix of fury and confusion. Realizing she had to play along to stay in the king's good graces, Lady Rose's expression instantly shifted a beaming, treacherous mask of joy. She pulled Arya into a tight, fake embrace, calling her honey bunny with a voice like poisoned honey, while Arya realized this woman was a dangerous hypocrite. Arya knew she had to watch her back, especially as the fake woman dragged her away to meet her new bestie, Princess Grace. They were led into a grand room where the young princess sat among her toys, looking every bit the pampered royal. The two girls locked eyes, a silent battle for dominance beginning the moment their gazes, while the adults, oblivious, requested they place. Grace tilted her head with a deceptive sweetness, asking if Arya was there to be her friend while making it very clear that Lady Rose belonged to her alone. She shamelessly demanded that Arya spoil her, weaponizing her position as the younger sister to ensure she remained the center of attention. Arya's expression soured, her patience already wearing thin at the blatant manipulation. Grace immediately began flaunting her wealth, leading Arya through a room filled with sparkling toys and rows of dresses that looked like they were spun from sunlight. When Arya tried to maintain a shred of dignity by mentioning the etiquette teacher's rules about boundaries, Grace's face twisted into a piteous mask of sorrow, her eyes welling with tears as she asked if a teacher was more important than their friendship. It was a trap of pure guilt, and Arya felt herself sinking as she saw the girl's watery, accusing eyes. She realized with a heavy sigh that Grace was a world-class drama queen, especially when the princess stuck her in a tiny, miserable servant's cot despite promising to share her room. As the moon rose, Grace lounged comfortably on her massive bed while Arya lay on the hard cot, only to be interrupted when the princess intentionally dropped a glass marble and demanded Arya retrieve it. Arya's heart burned with indignation, but she knew she had to pick her battles if she wanted to survive this den of vipers. She got onto her hands and knees, searching the floor in the dim light. When she finally found the toy and handed it back, Grace offered a chirpy thanks that felt like a slap, confirming Arya was being treated as nothing more than a maid. Arya forced a strained smile, deciding to keep her head down for now to avoid rocking the boat while she was still a newcomer. The next morning, a spark of genuine excitement lit up Arya's eyes as she saw the beautiful clothes being prepared for her. The maids bustled around, dressing her in a fine blue gown, but the joy vanished when Arya realized it was just a discarded outfit that Grace had grown sick of. Still, she followed behind as they entered the royal garden, where Grace preened in a magnificent pink dress that sparkled under the sun. They walked side by side, a picture-perfect image of sisterly love. But the air was thick with Arya's growing resentment. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed through the garden as a slap landed with shocking force, leaving Grace reeling in total disbelief. The reflection in Grace's tearful eyes showed a cold, defiant Arya, the mask finally slipping. But the timing was catastrophic as King Cyrus arrived at that exact moment, his eyes narrowing as he heard Grace's heart-wrenching sobs. He stood over them, a towering figure of royal authority, demanding to know what had transpired in his garden. Arya stood frozen under the suffocating pressure of her father's gaze while Grace sobbed theatrically, claiming her heart was breaking from the pain. The Emperor's statuesque profile remained unmoved by the display of grief, his eyes piercing through the facade while Arya could only look on with a heavy heart. 10 minutes earlier, the sun had been shining brightly on a scene of supposed sisterly love in the royal gardens. The two girls had been playing together, a rare moment of peace in a palace filled with thorns. But the peace was shattered when the sparkling blue orb Grace held suddenly slipped from her grasp. It rolled through the grass with agonizing slowness, heading straight for the muddy banks of the water. With a splash, the precious toy was gone, sinking into the muck. Grace's face immediately twisted into that of a wretched brat, her voice rising as she demanded that Arya retrieve it from the filth regardless of the danger. When Arya stood her ground, refusing to ruin her dress or risk a fall, Grace's temper flared into a murderous aura as she shrieked for her to get it now. The girl's true nature erupted as she lunged forward, her hands tangling painfully in Arya's golden locks, while she screeched that, as her best friend, was obligated to do exactly as she was told. Arya struggled to break free from the violent grip, pleading for her to let go. The situation escalated until Grace, consumed by a spoiled rage, shoved Arya with all her might, her eyes wide with a terrifying malice. It was a moment of pure survival instinct as Arya's hand flew out in a sharp arc. The sound of the slap echoed through the garden, a desperate act of defiance that brought the world to a sudden, ringing standstill. Back in the present, the Emperor's gaze was colder than winter snow as he looked down at the trembling Arya. Grace hid her wicked snicker behind a facade of tears, reveling in the trouble she'd stirred up. With a dismissive wave, the tyrant ordered the maids to take Grace away and patch up her face, leaving Arya alone to face his judgment. He loomed over the small girl, his presence an intimidating shadow that seemed to swallow the light. Arya's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as she clutched at her dress, terrified of what the man before her would do. He asked if she truly thought playing the silent game would save her from his wrath. Then, in a move that defied her expectations, the godlike man knelt before her, his hand reaching out to touch her golden hair. He wasn't angry about the slap, he was disappointed in her silence, warning her that such meekness would turn her into a punching bag for the vultures of the Ball Empire. Arya looked up with big, teary eyes that sparkled like gems, asking with a trembling voice if he would actually listen to her side of the story. He assured her that as her father, he wanted to hear everything, his voice dropping to a doting murmur. As a single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, he caught it with a gentle touch. He whispered that while tears were a powerful weapon for sympathy, she must only ever show such vulnerability to him. To the rest of the world, she had to be tough, fearless, and even dirty if necessary to survive the political den of snakes awaiting her. If she couldn't master that strength, he couldn't in good conscience send her away. Overwhelmed by this unexpected warmth, Arya threw herself into his arms, sobbing into his regal cloak as she called out to her father. Yet, even as she embraced him, a shadow of doubt lingered in her mind as she walked the long, lonely halls of the palace. She knew his kindness might just be a gilded cage, a necessity for a political marriage, yet she found herself desperately wanting to believe in this version of a father. She wished she had never uncovered the dark truths in the history of the Elven Kingdom. For now, she wanted to head first into his love, even if it was an illusion that would eventually destroy her. Later, Grace cornered her in the hallway, her face twisted in a sneer as she mocked Arya's sad puppy expression, and declared that their friendship was officially dead. She slammed the door to their shared room with a resounding bang, leaving Arya standing in the chilling silence of the corridor. Left alone, Arya felt a sudden, icy shiver crawl down her spine as the palace seemed to transform into a place of ghosts. She wandered into a wing of the castle she had never seen, where felt heavy and the shadows seemed to reach out for her. Her curiosity led her to a pair of massive, iron-bound doors that pulsed with a dark energy. Rumors of the Emperor's harem flickered through her mind, whispers of wives who simply vanished, leaving behind a terrifying secret hidden within the palace walls. Just as she reached out to touch the door, a stern voice shattered the silence, demanding to know what she was doing in a forbidden area. A high-ranking concubine stood there, her eyes sharp as she warned the 7th princess never to return to this cursed place. Arya was led away, her mind racing with questions about what lay behind that door and why it was kept under such heavy guard. She was ushered back to her room and tucked into bed, but sleep was a distant dream. As soon as she was sure she was alone, her eyes snapped open in the dark. She had to know the truth. Was Cyrus a doting father or a psycho monster hiding his victims in the dark? Today, she wandered the palace grounds with a renewed sense of purpose, searching for answers. Instead, she ran into Andy, whose handsome face was clouded with annoyance. He looked at her with a mix of irritation and intrigue, reminding her of the absolute storm she had caused by ditching their engagement at the altar. Arya looked at him shamelessly, asking if he actually expected an apology or if he truly wanted to go through with a marriage to someone like her. Andy's lips curled into a mysterious smirk as he watched the girl who had dared to defy the social order, his gaze lingering on her with a newfound interest. The air was thick with the cold reality of royal duty as the young prince spoke of political marriages with a chilling detachment. To him, these unions were nothing more than calculated deals for mutual gain. A perspective that left Arya staring at him with a mix of disbelief and disdain. He didn't care who he ended up with, a sentiment that made her wonder if all men were this two-faced and hollow. His nonchalance was suffocating as he confirmed that the identity of his future bride was entirely irrelevant to him. Arya watched him, her green eyes shimmering with a quiet frustration at his lack of heart. He looked down at her with a faint, mocking smile, finding her reaction amusing rather than concerning. The tense exchange was suddenly shattered by a shrill voice calling out her name. Grace stormed toward them, her face twisted in a mask of indignation as she demanded to know what they were doing together. Her aura was heavy with jealousy, her purple eyes flashing as she approached with a purposeful stride. She accused Arya of being a traitor, ditching her to hang out with a boy after their spat the day before. The drama was exhausting. Arya could only look on as Grace played the part of the victim with practiced ease. Arya's eye twitched in annoyance at the sheer absurdity of the situation. The prince leaned in, his voice a low whisper that sent a shiver of irritation down her spine, suggesting she was only this desperate for marriage to escape her miserable life. Arya shot him a sharp look, telling him it was none of his business. He just chuckled, offering a cruel suggestion to grovel if she wanted his help. Arya's pride wouldn't allow it, her silhouette stiff with defiance. The trio stood in a stalemate of petty grievances until Grace finally turned away, huffing a final word of dismissal. She stormed off, leaving Arya and the prince in the golden light of the hallway. But the peace was short-lived, as the scene shifted to Lady Rose's bedroom where chaos had erupted. Lady Rose was in a state of pure hysteria, hers echoing through the opulent room as she screamed at her maids. The eternal youth pearl, a priceless gift from the king himself, had vanished, and its loss was nothing short of treason. She clutched her head in agony, demanding to know who was the last person to see it. Grace stood frozen as Rose's gaze landed on her, a sharp halt in the tension that filled the air. Lady Rose towered over the girls, her eyes narrowing as she asked if Grace had stolen the treasure. Terrified, Grace's survival instincts kicked in, and she shamelessly the finger at the easiest target, claiming it was Arya who had lost it. Arya could only watch in silent horror as the lie took hold. She tried to defend herself, stating she didn't even know what the pearl was. But Lady Rose wasn't interested in words. She had a more terrifying method of the truth. With a wave of her hand, a glowing magic circle appeared, pulsating with a lavender light. She was unleashing the Truth Seeker, a magical beast that devoured human dreams and pried into one's deepest thoughts. Arya's heart hammered against her ribs. If that thing caught her, all her secrets would be laid bare. The beast materialized, a strange, tapir-like creature surrounded by swirling mists of magic. As it lunged, Arya's instincts took over, and she dodged the creature with a desperate swish of her skirts. She had to get away, her feet flying across the ornate carpet as she bolted for the exit. The maids scrambled to grab her, their voices rising in a chorus of alarm. Arya didn't look back, her breath come in ragged gasps as she sprinted toward the restricted wing of the palace. The maids cried out for her to stop, warning her that the area was strictly off limits. But the fear of the Truth Seeker was far greater. She pushed through her exhaustion, her eyes wide with terror as she reached a massive, imposing set of doors. With a final burst of strength, she stumbled through the entrance, falling flat on her face as the heavy doors slammed shut behind her. She was now in a place where no one was allowed, a silent, chilling sanctuary. Lady Rose's voice echoed one last time, a cold warning for the seventh prince never to return. Arya lay on the cold floor, trembling as she realized the gravity of her situation. Outside, the maids huddled in fear, wondering who could possibly be inside that forbidden hall. Arya stood up, her small hands balled in fists as she stared into the darkness, the silence of the room swallowing her whole. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of history and secrets. She looked up to find herself in a grand gallery, the walls lined with portraits of royalty from ages past. In the center of the room stood a man, his back to her, draped in a regal red uniform and a flowing black cape. He held a sword, its blade gleaming with a dangerous light as he stood before a private shrine. He turned, his handsome etched with a profound, soul-crushing loneliness that took her breath away. He noted that no one had been in this room for ages, his gaze piercing through her. Arya stammered an apology, explaining she was being hunted and had nowhere else to run. She looked around, realizing this was a place of mourning for the old king. The man stood before a portrait of a beautiful woman, filled with a heartbreak so deep it seemed he was drowning in it. He asked if she had stirred up some serious trouble, his voice surprisingly calm despite the sword in his hand. Arya approached him, her voice small but steady as she maintained her innocence regarding the pearl. He listened, his expression unreadable as she argued that stealing such a thing would be pointless for someone as young as her. He remarked that she was exactly like her, the woman in the portrait, with that same razor-sharp mouth. Arya looked at the painting of Emily Noel, the 13th Elven Kingdom ruler, and felt a strange connection. She realized that while the room was off limits, he came here alone to stare at his family, to touch the frames of those he missed. She pointed out that while one portrait was worn from his touch, the one of Emily was covered in dust, suggesting he couldn't even stand to look at her. The man didn't deny it, his silence confirming her observation. Arya looked up at him, her green eyes softening as she realized that despite his intimidating aura, he was a softie at heart. She promised to keep his secret, her small hand reaching out to hold his in a gesture of unexpected comfort. He looked down at her, the coldness in his eyes finally beginning to thaw. Instead of punishing her, he told her that her days of running off to study elsewhere were over. She would stay right here in the palace. He told her to hit the books and stop causing chaos, a command that felt more like a protective embrace than a royal decree. A month had slipped away like sand through an hourglass, bringing with it a new era for the royal elementary where tradition was being traded for a rigorous pursuit of excellence. Arya stood before the towering, majestic halls of learning, her heart swelling as she contemplated the seminars and elite tutoring that awaited the best of the best. In the distance, the golden-haired Prince Lucian moved like a sun around which all others orbited, his presence in an effortless, cold authority that kept the common crowd at a respectful distance. As the silence stretched between them, Arya couldn't help but recall their past friction, the memories of their clashes flickering like ghosts against the backdrop of the school's grand architecture. The kingdom was changing, fueled by the revolutionary Education for All Act that had turned the once exclusive royal sanctuary into a melting pot for handpicked talent. Now, the children of high-ranking nobles, even the most brilliant commoners, found themselves breathing the same air as royalty, a shift that felt as incredible as it was precarious. It was a bold move, one that signaled the king's unwavering commitment to progress, even if it ruffled the feathers of the traditionalists. Whispers followed the king's wake, with many noting that when the sovereign set his mind to something, his resolve was as unyielding as iron. But not everyone was embracing this new world with open arms. In the lush gardens, a young princess wept bitter tears, her heart breaking at the thought of leaving her pampered life behind. She wailed for her doll and her mother, terrified of the strangers and the stifling expectations of the academy. The noble ladies watched with a mix of pity and frustration, wondering what could have possibly triggered the king's sudden change of heart regarding the education of women. He had always harbored a deep-seated disdain for girls meddling in politics or books, yet here he was, forcing even his youngest daughters into the fray. Lady Aurelia watched in silence as the young princess's grief curdled into something far darker, her small hands trembling as she whispered a chilling curse for everyone to drop dead. A murderous aura seemed to cling to the child as she clutched her rabbit doll, her eyes reflecting a cold, simmering rage that was far too heavy for someone so small. Back in the throne room, the shockwaves continued as the nobility realized that all 7 princes were being sent to school, a move that felt like a direct challenge to the status quo. Lucian watched the proceedings with a sharp, observant gaze, sensing the subtle shift in the king's demeanor that even the most seasoned courtiers couldn't ignore. The air was thick with the desperate pleas of fathers begging for their sons to be granted entry into the prestigious academy. One noble after another stepped forward, shamelessly promoting their children as the perfect age for enrollment. The king's patience was clearly wearing thin as the room devolved into a chaotic cacophony of ambitious voices. It was a relentless, mindless chatter that made the sovereign's eyes twitch in annoyance. Outside, the news of the screening process reached Arya, filling her with a spark of hope for her own family's future. She was stunned by the king's newfound flexibility, wondering if the man she once feared was truly becoming so easygoing. If her brothers could pass the test, they would finally be by her side again, shielding her from the loneliness of the palace. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she imagined their reunion, a radiant smile gracing her face. She didn't waste a moment, lifting her skirts and racing off to share the news with Muriel. At the Grand Ware Manor, the message was delivered with urgent excitement. The brothers needed to prepare for the entrance exams immediately. While one brother met the challenge with a determined blush, the other couldn't help but tease, questioning if a loser like him could ever survive such a fancy school. The insult landed like a physical blow, sparking a flash of indignation that filled the room. Their bickering was a familiar, comforting melody, even as the weight of their responsibility toward Arya hung in the air. Their guardian watched them with a soft, wistful look, praying that Arya was holding her own in that den of vipers. Arya was doing more than just surviving. She was thriving, walking through the academy with her head held high and her books clutched tight. Sitting in the vast lecture hall, she felt a strange sense of nostalgia, her previous life's education giving her an edge she intended to weaponize to become the master of her own fate. She dove headfirst into the complex world of elvish writing, her focus so intense that the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Even as the sun began to set over the ornate palace walls, the 7th princess remained buried in her studies, her dedication becoming the talk of the servants and the court. They watched her from the shadows, amazed by the sheer willpower of the girl who refused to rest. A small, proud smile touched a maid's lips as she witnessed the princess's tireless efforts. Arya knew that in this world, magical power was the only true currency of respect. She was determined to shatter the misogynistic prejudices of the Elven Kingdom, where women were seen as weak and unworthy of the arcane arts. She would become strong that the metaphorical sword hanging over her head would finally disappear. When it came to ancient spells, Arya was a natural, her modern study techniques allowing her to master incantations that took others years to grasp. Her teacher couldn't help but praise her, noting how she picked up complex water manipulation spells with terrifying speed. But her brilliance only served to stoke the fire's resentment among her peers. The other princesses whispered behind their fans, labeling her a lucky show-off who would never be more than an adopted joke. Among them sat Bilia, the 4th princess, her gaze as sharp and cold as a blade as she watched the new arrival. She didn't join in the petty gossip, her silence more intimidating than any insult, her focus remaining entirely on her own path. The sky was suddenly choked with a flurry of ominous purple wings as a swarm of crows descended upon the terrified students. Screams of pure agony echoed through the courtyard as the murderous aura of the birds felt all too real, their sharp beaks snapping at the air in a frenzied attack. Panic spread like wildfire, with children scrambling for safety and begging for someone to save them from this feathered nightmare. But amidst the chaos, Arya remained unnervingly still, her sharp eyes scanning the frantic scene with a clarity that defied her age. She realized the truth instantly. These weren't monsters out for blood, but mere magical constructs designed to weed out the weak. Looking closely, she pointed out the crimson restriction marks glowing in the crow's eyes, a clear sign that these beasts were merely illusions meant to test their resolve. If they wanted to survive this trial, they couldn't just cower. They had to stay calm and unleash their own summoning spells to drive the shadows away. The freckled girl beside her could only stare in awe, wondering how a mere 6-year-old could possess such icy composure while everyone else was losing their minds in fear. Suddenly, a voice dripping with disdain cut through the air, labeling them all a bunch of pathetic losers. It was Princess Belia, the star of the Elven royal family, walking through the fray with the elegance and arrogance of a true monarch. With a flick of her wrist, a brilliant azure light erupted, swirling around her in a suffocating pressure of raw mana. From the depths of the blue flames, a majestic peacock spirit manifested, its ethereal feathers shimmering with a godlike radiance that instantly forced the crows to retreat. The students erupted in cheers, worshipping the ground she walked on, for she was the only deemed capable of standing toe-to-toe with the formidable Prince Lucian. Belia soaked in the adoration, her expression void of warmth as she maintained the cold attitude expected of the Empire's female heir. She looked down on her peers as if they were nothing more than dirt under her nails, fully aware of her status as a walking national treasure. But the celebration was cut short when a pillar of golden light, far more intense than any blue flame, pierced through the sky and commanded everyone's attention. The atmosphere shifted instantly, a scorching heat radiating from the center of the yard as a legendary phoenix from the embers. The sheer power of the firebird was staggering, incinerating the remaining crows in an instant and leaving the onlookers breathless with shock. Arya stood at the heart of the inferno, her gaze steady as she commanded the mythical beast with effortless grace. Bilia's mask of perfection cracked, a sharp click of her tongue betraying the bitterly boiling within her as she realized had been stolen by a supposed inferior. Soon the whispers began to change, with the commoners hailing Arya as their pride and joy, the one who proved that even someone with commoner blood could reach the pinnacle of magic. Arya, however, had no interest in being a symbol. She just wanted to be left alone to study in peace and avoid unnecessary drama. Her newfound popularity didn't sit well with everyone, especially a group of highborn girls who watched from the shadows with eyes full of venom. They saw her as nothing but a knockoff princess with a pathetic cheerleading squad, and their glares promised a storm was brewing in the halls of the academy. Later in the quiet, sun-drenched sanctuary of the study hall, the tension finally snapped. Arya's friend, the sweet, freckled girl, was cornered by the bullies for the perceived crime of sitting in a seat reserved for royalty. The poor girl was shoved to the ground, her books scattered as she trembled and begged for forgiveness from the sneering aristocrats who loomed over her. When Arya walked past, her face was an unreadable mask, seemingly ignoring her friend's plight as she moved toward her own desk. The freckled girl's heart sank, feeling the cold sting of abandonment as Arya continued on without a single word of comfort. But Arya was playing a different game, settling into her seat with a heavy heart, knowing that the schoolyard politics were just beginning and she had to be careful. It didn't take long for the bullies to turn their attention toward her, a girl with a smug grin intentionally tripping and sending a heavy book crashing onto Arya's desk. The girl feigned innocence, her voice dripping with fake concern as she claimed to be so clumsy while clearly enjoying the mess she'd made. Arya stared at the ruined pages of her work, her silence only emboldening the cruel laughter of the crowd, who told her she'd better learn to keep her head down. Internally, Arya could only sigh at the absurdity of it all, feeling exhausted by the prospect of dealing with snot-nosed brats after everything she had been through in her past life. Her notebook was now covered in crude, insulting drawings of pigs, a childish attempt to break her spirit that only served to annoy her. From across the room, Prince Lucian watched the scene unfold with a detached, cold gaze that offered no hope of help. When his companion asked if he intended to intervene, the prince's response was as sharp as a blade. He wasn't insane enough to stick his neck out for someone as troublesome as her. The corridor echoed with the cruel laughter of boys who found joy in the misery of others, their sneers sharp as they tossed a heavy bag out the window like it was nothing more than garbage. Arya stood frozen, her heart sinking as she watched her belongings vanish, the shadows of her classmates looming over her like predatory beasts as they mocked her very existence. They looked down from the balcony with eyes full of malice, declaring she was so pathetic she might as well crawl into a hole and die from the sheer shame of it all. But beneath her quiet exterior, a spark of defiance flickered. She knew dealing with such petty souls was a waste of breath, yet the urge to stand up for herself burned hot in her chest even as she resolved to keep her suffering a secret to avoid unnecessary drama. Her footsteps were heavy as she descended the stone stairs, trying to shake off the suffocating pressure of their words. Suddenly, the rhythmic thud of boots caught her attention, and her emerald eyes widened as she spotted a line of guards practicing their drills in the courtyard. They moved with a statuesque precision, a sea of blue and white marching in perfect unison. However, one guard was anything but perfect, his arms flailing wildly as he stumbled out of step, looking like a lost kitten among lions. Recognition hit her like a bolt of lightning, and she couldn't help but wave frantically, her voice bright as she called out to Anar. The poor boy was so startled he forgot where he was, earning him a sharp, painful blow from the instructor's staff that made the air ring with a heavy wham. The instructor loomed over the recruit with a murderous aura, demanding he keep his eyes front during drills while the boy stammered out a terrified apology. Arya clutched her face in guilt, wishing she hadn't caused him such trouble during his grueling training session. The moment break time was announced, Anar came charging toward her, his face lighting up with a pure, infectious joy. He pulled her into a suffocating embrace, tears streaming down his face as he wailed about how much he had missed her, before pulling back to desperately ask if he looked badass in his new uniform. Sitting together on a bench, Arya's curiosity got the better of her as she wondered how her friend had ended up as a guard so suddenly. Anar's expression crumbled into one of pure misery as he confessed the truth. He had completely bombed the written exam and was rejected from the school, leaving him unable to stay by her side as a fellow student. Arya quickly pushed aside her own problems to weaponize her cuteness, beaming at him and insisting he was the best and would surely become the most powerful royal guard in history. When he asked about Avery, she scoffed, calling the boy a dumb head who probably wouldn't even make it past the interview. Anar's mood shifted as he looked at her tenderly, asking how she had really been holding up in his absence. A shadow of pain crossed her face for only a second before she masked it with a bright, fake smile, resolving not to let him stress about the girls bullying her. She shamelessly claimed she was doing amazing, even joking about chunky she had gotten just to see him laugh and keep his heart at ease. But the peaceful moment was shattered when a group of girls approached with venom dripping from their tongues, mocking Arya for butting up to a mere guard. The leader's gaze was colder than winter snow, her eyes narrowed as she targeted the girl she loved to torment. Anar looked on in confusion, but Arya, desperate to protect him from the coming storm, urged him to return to his squad before things got ugly. As they walked away from the bench, the air grew thick with tension, the silence between the girls feeling like a physical weight. The fourth princess's hand clamped down on Arya's shoulder with a bruising force, her voice a low hiss as she mocked her for being like a dog that came crawling back at a single whistle. Arya's breath hitched in pain as the grip tightened, her face contorting in a grimace. The bully smirked, asking if Arya planned to blast her with magic, her expression full of wretched confidence. Arya's gaze turned icy as she reminded herself that in the Elven Kingdom, using magic on regular people was a crime that could lead to a cold jail cell. She forced herself to release her grip on her own power, her hands trembling as the bully continued to taunt her for thinking she was special. The girls circled her like vultures, sneering that she shouldn't think she could outshine everyone just because she could cast spells. They demanded she show respect to her highness, their voices full of an intimidating, suffocating pressure. Suddenly, a sharp strike landed against Arya's back, a physical blow that sent a jolt of shock through her small frame. The bully screamed for her to shut up, her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. But something inside Arya finally snapped, and she grabbed the wrist, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light as she prepared to see who was the real deal. The bully told her to let go, but Arya stood her ground, her gaze turning as sharp as a blade as she told them to bring it on. The princess smirked, declaring that Arya was doomed, but the young girl didn't flinch. With a voice full of quiet steel, Arya reminded them that winners get to talk trash, not losers, and that her summoning magic had already wiped the floor with them once before. Infuriated by the defiance, the princess's face twisted in rage, demanding that Arya run those words by her one more time. Without a shred of fear, Arya stated clearly that she had kicked their asses and would gladly do it again no matter how many times they fought. The response was a violent slap that sent Arya's head reeling, her cheek burning with a crimson mark that stung with the weight of her humiliation. But before another blow could land, a shadow fell over them, and Anar appeared like a guardian deity, his hand swinging in a powerful arc that sent the bully stumbling back in shock. He moved with a speed born of desperation, his eyes blazing with a protective fury as he stood over the girl who had dared to touch his sister. He gently checked on Arya, his voice full of worry as he asked if she was all right while looking at the mark on her face. He caressed her bruised cheek with a tender touch, promising with a doting intensity that he would never let anyone mess with her again. Arya tried to get him to leave, terrified he would lose his position for hitting a noble. But Princess was already screaming in a high-pitched frenzy. She shrieked for the guards, her face a mask of disbelief that a piece of junk had actually hit her. As a crowd of guards gathered, the princess demanded they all be thrown into the slammer, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Anar didn't back down an inch, blocking Arya from view and calling the princess an ugly witch for picking on his little sister. The royal's face turned a hideous shade of purple as she shrieked that they were nothing but worthless pieces of trash and that they were both as good as dead. The air crackled with a suffocating pressure as the shout echoed through the halls, a desperate plea for Anar to stop. A firm hand clamped down, halting her frantic movements with a suddenness that stole her breath. Meanwhile, at the imposing gates of Ware Manor, a hooded figure leaned against the stone, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath after a narrow escape. He had barely slipped away from the palace guards, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he realized they were still hot on his trail, the young prince stared at the grand estate, his gaze softening with a mix of longing and anxiety as he wondered if she would even want to see his face after everything. Suddenly, his sharp eyes caught a glimpse of a familiar small figure strolling through the courtyard, and a mischievous glint returned to his eyes. With a playful leap, he popped out of the shadows, catching the boy completely off guard and sending a jolt of pure shock through the poor child. The boy scowled, clearly unimpressed by the prince's antics, and demanded to know what business he could possibly have here. The prince's playful smile faltered when he heard the bitter news Arya had become the laughingstock of the entire kingdom, a princess abandoned at the very altar where her future was supposed to begin. The realization hit him like a physical blow, his eyes widening in disbelief as the weight of the scandal sank in. The young boy's voice trembled with rage as he spat out how their family could no longer show their faces in polite society, all because of the wretched games played by the high and mighty. Stunned into silence, the prince felt a cold shiver of guilt wash over him, his mind reeling at the chaos he had inadvertently caused. In a sudden burst of desperation, he grabbed the boy's shoulders, his voice thick with panic as he demanded to know where the princess was and if she was even safe. Far away from the chaos, tucked within the cold stone walls of solitary confinement, Arya sat huddled on the floor, her small frame looking fragile in the dim light. She could almost hear the venomous whispers of the consorts as they clung to the emperor, weeping crocodile tears and begging for to be broken and punished. But the heavy door creaked open, not for a jailer, but for a man whose presence radiated a gentle warmth that pierced through the gloom her beloved brother Muriel. A soft smile graced his handsome features as he told her that her big brother had come to find her, no matter the cost. She threw herself into his arms, her voice trembling with worry as she begged for news of Anar's fate. Muriel pulled back just enough to look in her emerald eyes, reassuring her that Anar was tough and had only been sent to city guards boot camp. He had connections among the guards who would watch over the boy, ensuring that he wouldn't suffer more than a few bruises for his loyalty. Arya let out a long, shaky breath, her heart finally slowing down as she vowed to be stronger next time, reasoning that the Emperor wouldn't dare execute his hand-picked princess so soon after the wedding disaster. She looked up at Muriel with a determined sparkle in her eyes, telling him not to sweat it because she was far more resilient than she looked. A small, hopeful smile at her lips as she whispered to herself that perhaps the tyrant Cyrus wasn't as heartless as the world believed. Deep down, she felt a strange, lingering intuition that he wouldn't truly raise a hand to hurt her. At that very moment, in the opulent throne room, the Emperor sat in a statuesque silence, his emerald eyes cold and unreadable. The consorts wailed and gnashed their teeth, painting Arya as a monster who picked on the innocent, demanding a punishment that would match her supposed crimes. But with a voice like cracking ice, the Emperor silenced them all, decreeing a mere month of confinement and extratutoring a punishment so light it felt like a slap on the wrist. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the court as his words settled, leaving the consorts fuming in their beautiful, wretched silks. Back in her room, Arya sighed as she leaned over her desk, the weight her studies feeling like a physical burden. Suddenly, a familiar, smug voice drifted through the window, offering her of this gilded cage if only she was willing to beg for his mercy. She didn't miss a beat, turning to the prince with a raised eyebrow and a sharp tongue, asking why he was still lingering in this kingdom if his own empire was such a paradise. The prince's handsome face twisted in annoyance, his ego bruised by her refusal to be a damsel in distress. With a defiant huff, Arya slammed the window shut, cutting him off mid-sentence as she turned back to the mountains of books waiting for her. Days bled into one another as she devoured every page she could find, her thirst for knowledge becoming her only escape from the boredom of the palace. Her tutor watched her with a mixture of surprise and admiration, noting the Emperor's decree might have been a hidden blessing rather than a curse. Arya couldn't help but wonder if the tyrant simply enjoyed having her around, her cheeks flushing slightly at the absurd thought. To reward her diligence, the tutor led her through the winding corridors to a place hidden from common eyes. Her jaw dropped as the doors swung open to reveal the royal library, a cathedral of knowledge that seemed to stretch into infinity. The head librarian informed her with a proud smile that this was the largest collection on the entire continent, containing over 1 million stories. The very next morning, Arya practically skipped back to the library, her eyes sparkling with a joy that could outshine the sun. Cyrus watched from a distance as the little princess hurried past, his gaze lingering on her retreating form with a flicker of something that wasn't quite anger. She disappeared into the sanctuary of books, her small heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. The guard beside the Emperor chuckled, calling her a precious little bookworm, while Cyrus simply watched with a brooding, silent intensity. The guard quickly stifled his laughter under the Emperor's chilling gaze, realizing that even a tyrant's patience had its limits. With a final, sharp huff, Cyrus turned and walked away, choosing to let the little princess have her sanctuary for now. Deep within the stacks, Arya's breath hitched as she pulled a dusty volume from the shelf, her eyes widening when she saw the queen's own signature on the title page. She sat on the floor, completely lost in the words written by the woman who had once held the kingdom in her palm. The librarian whispered that the queen used to spend all her days in this very spot, and Arya felt a profound connection to the past, her heart swelling with a new sense of purpose. But as she immersed herself in the queen's legacy, she failed to notice the mysterious, glowing eyes watching from the shadows above, a silent witness to the unfolding fate of the little princess. The butler smiled warmly, telling the young princess that her late majesty was a total bookworm just like her. Arya's sparkled with pure joy as she realized she shared a trait with the legendary queen. The butler chuckled, his expression softening as he confirmed her suspicion. He reminisced about how the queen had been a vibrant firecracker, full of life and sweetness. He laughed, recalling a time she tore the palace apart looking for a book, only to find it tucked under her own pillow. She really was such a silly, adorable woman. Ariana couldn't help but giggle, imagining the royal's clumsy charm. But the laughter died in her throat as a wave of longing hit her. She truly wished the queen were still around. She wondered why the queen had to leave for the Tower of God, suspecting it was out of a deep sense of guilt for leaving her behind. The butler's face fell as he explained the queen's descent into depression after the prince was born, leading to a suffocating isolation where no one could reach her. Unbeknownst to them, a pair of sharp, calculating eyes watched from the shadows, a woman in a crimson gown listening to every word. This noblewoman sneered, ordering her maid to spill everything to the king's right-hand man, eager to see the snooper punished for digging up royal secrets. A chilling smirk played on her lips as she plotted her next move in this dangerous game of shadows. Far from the library's gloom, the sun-drenched palace gardens played host to a tense tea party. The king King sat with the young prince, his gaze sharp and demanding. In the distance, a young boy watched from the bushes, his heart racing as he tried to remain hidden. The king's voice was like ice, noting that the boys weren't supposed to show their faces at the same time and questioning if they were ready to break the rules. He resolved to sort out his brother, who had been acting like a spoiled brat since his return. The prince sipped his tea calmly, knowing Nicholas would soon handle the situation. Back in the safety of Andy's room, the air was thick with resentment as the twin brothers faced off. Andy was reaching his breaking point, tired of being a prisoner while his brother played the part of a prince. He teased his brother about his feelings for Ariana, watching with a smirk as the other boy's face turned a brilliant shade of red. The prince stammered in denial, his heart hammering against his ribs as he accused Andy of trying to make a fool of him. Andy just scoffed, suggesting that maybe he should have just married her himself to live a life of luxury. The thought of a suffocating, married life left the prince petrified, his mind reeling at the absurd suggestion. Their bickering was cut short as Nicholas entered, his presence radiating a cold, authoritative aura. He didn't have time for their petty sibling rivalry, his expression hardening as he prepared to intervene. With a casual flick of his wrist, Nicholas unleashed a surge of divine power, the shimmering light of the heavens illuminating the room. Andy gasped as he was suddenly hoisted into the air, his limbs bound by invisible, glowing threads. He thrashed against the magical restraints, screaming for Nicholas to let him go. But the man only looked on with a serene, mocking smile. The divine pressure was overwhelming, pinning the boy in place as a containment space formed around him. Nicholas suggested the young prince work on his patience, promising that a bit of divine purification would do him some good. The other brother could only watch in stunned silence as Nicholas turned to leave, dismissing the chaos behind him. A month of grueling house arrest finally came to an end, and Ariana stepped out to the bright morning air of Royal Elementary. She was determined to find Anar at the barracks. Her path was suddenly blocked by a group of sneering students. They looked down at her with pure disdain, mocking her as the marriage princess. Ariana froze, her heart sinking as she realized she was a walking disaster in their eyes. The leader of the group stepped closer, her voice dripping with venom as she claimed that bad luck followed Ariana everywhere. She cruelly revealed that because of Ariana's snooping, the old librarian and several palace staff members had been thrown into the cold, dark dungeons. The memory of that day flashed back 10 days earlier, when the king had learned of the gossip surrounding the queen. His fury had been absolute, his voice booming through the halls as he ordered an investigation into everyone who had dared to disrespect the crown. He had slammed his sword down, demanding that the offenders be dragged to the dungeons without mercy. The innocent librarian and the trembling maid were hauled away in chains, their pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Reality crashed down on Ariana like a tidal wave, and she turned and fled, her vision blurred by tears. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, wondering why her world was falling apart and why she was the cause of so much suffering. The sun beat down on the golden spires of the palace, but for Arya, there was no warmth to be found as she stood before the king's quarters, desperate for an audience. The towering guards stood like statues, their faces devoid of pity as they barred her path, claiming the king was resting and refused to see anyone. Her heart sank, but she wouldn't be swayed so easily. She would wait right there until he woke up, no matter how long it took. But the guards were cold, ordering her to leave immediately, leaving her to realize with a pang of sorrow that it had been 3 long days since she last saw Cyrus. It was painfully obvious now that he was avoiding her, and as she walked away, the weight of the palace rumors crushed her spirit, making her wonder if he was truly going to kill all those innocent people just for speaking of what happened to the queen. The guilt was a suffocating pressure in her chest, a realization that it was all her fault the librarian had been killed, and she could feel the hot sting of tears prickling her eyes. She had actually believed there was a sliver of humanity left in that man, a hope that he wasn't a complete loss, but now it felt like a cruel, stupid joke. Looking at his cold, handsome profile in her mind, she saw nothing but a tyrant, a stone-cold monster who dragged the innocent into his path of destruction. Why was he so sensitive about anything involving the queen, and what did it have to do with that dreaded Tower of God? Memories of her past life and the king's icy command to send her away to that cursed place flashed before her, filling her with a bone-deep terror. Sitting in her classroom at the Royal Elementary, Arya realized that what Cyrus truly feared was the truth about the switched prince. And if she wanted to protect the people she cared about, she needed real power, the kind of absolute power that only a crown could provide. She needed to see the queen, to save the Weirs and that poor librarian, and that meant seizing control of her own destiny. Her small fist clenched tight as she resolved to change her fate. Meanwhile, in a hidden containment space, a young boy fought against a literal windstorm, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to break through the magical bindings. With a sudden, violent burst of energy, he shattered the spells, surprising even the elegant, purple-haired man who watched him with a knowing smirk. The boy was exhausted, sick of the endless training that made him want to throw up, and he demanded to know if he could finally leave. The mentor merely chuckled, delivering the news that because they were both cursed with dark magic, a special exception was being made to allow them into the Elven King's most sacred site. The boy stared at the swirling energy, questioning what kind of place their most sacred site truly was. Back in the mundane world of the classroom, a different kind of storm was brewing as the teacher announced a surprise quiz, sending the students into a spiral of despair. Among them was Clara, the Duke's only daughter, who looked absolutely wretched as she begged for anyone to help her with the impossible math. Looking at Clara's messy, scribbled-over practice book, Arya saw more than just a struggling student. She saw an opportunity. Weaponizing her cuteness and brilliance, Arya leaned over with a gentle smile, telling the girl that these problems were actually quite easy once you knew the secret. As she began to explain the patterns of base 10 numbers, Clara watched with wide, sparkling eyes, completely captivated. Arya knew that Duke Philip was old money nobility with serious clout, and if she could win over his daughter, she would have access to a power base that even the king couldn't ignore. She showed Clara the magic of the times tables, a system that could crunch complex multiplication in seconds. The other students whispered in the shadows, their eyes narrow with suspicion as they wondered what the two were up to. Clara was so impressed that she shamelessly asked to sit with Arya, much to the shock of the onlookers. With a gracious nod, Arya welcomed her new ally, her plan moving forward perfectly. She put Clara to the test, asking for the product of 19 times 7. When Clara successfully calculated 133 using Arya's methods, the girl's face lit up with pure joy. She threw her arms around Arya, declaring her a lifesaver and a true friend, while the rest of the class watched in stunned silence. The bond was sealed in that embrace, a friendship born of necessity and genuine gratitude. But not everyone was happy. The sight of the Duke's precious daughter hanging out with a walking disaster like Arya sent ripples of shock through the room. Some dismissed it as Arya merely knowing how to kiss ass. But Princess Bilia's gaze was much more dangerous, her eyes flashing with a murderous aura as she watched her influence slip away. The success of Arya's plan was confirmed at the Duke's estate, where Clara ran to her parents, proudly waving her A-grade paper in the air. She gushed to her mother about how Arya was her guardian angel, the only reason she had finally aced a test. The Duchess was moved, thanking Arya for helping her daughter, who had always struggled so much with her studies. Arya remained the picture of modesty, claiming she had only shown Clara a few tricks and that the girl had the brains all along. The Duchess was floored by the young princess's brilliance, finding her truly incredible. Arya's thoughts drifted back to the kind librarian who had taught her everything, a bittersweet smile touching her lips as she credited someone special for her secret techniques. As Clara chatted excitedly about meeting this mystery teacher, Arya knew she had finally found the leverage she needed to survive in this den of vipers. Every move was a step toward the absolute power she needed to protect her world. Zentel. At the prestigious Royal Elementary, the air with the scent of ancient parchment and the quiet murmurs of young nobles struggling with their lessons, Arya, with a sparkle in her emerald eyes, shared the secrets of the Memory Palace technique, breaking down complex elvish spells into simple, familiar shapes like household brushes and fans. Her classmates watched in awe, their faces lighting up as the once impossible magic finally began to make sense. Among them was Rosa, the eldest daughter of the Marquess of Sussex, who couldn't help but gape at Arya's effortless brilliance. The classroom buzzed with newfound excitement as the children were encouraged to the spells on their own, the pressure of academia momentarily lifted by Arya's kindness. As the lesson ended, the blue-haired elven leaned in, wondering if Arya had learned such incredible tricks from a private tutor. Arya simply offered a mysterious, knowing smile, her mind already drifting elsewhere as she clutched her book to her chest. Meanwhile, in the suffocating silence of Cyrus's office, a different kind of magic was at play, the cold, calculating power of the throne. The Emir sat with a statuesque elegance, his sharp gaze cutting through the room as he listened to a desperate plea from a visiting noble. It seemed everyone was hounding him about the fate of a certain librarian, and the tyrant was reaching the end of his patience. With a weary hand to his temple, he questioned why everyone was suddenly so invested in a mere old man. Yielding to the pressure, he finally granted the request, deciding the man's talents would be better served at the school rather than rotting away in a cell. Back in the palace gardens, Prince Andy had finally managed to slip away from his handlers, his heart racing as he searched for a familiar face. When he finally spotted Arya, he could sense the heavy cloud of guilt hanging over her, her usual vibrance replaced by a somber shadow. She felt wretched, convinced that an innocent man was suffering because of her mistakes, and she snapped at Andy, wondering if he was only there to gloat over her misfortune. But the boy's expression softened, his gaze filled with a sincerity that caught her off guard as he asked how he could possibly help. Arya scoffed, her heart aching as she wondered if he could truly smuggle her and everyone she loved away from this gilded cage. She was drowning in secrets, her hands trembling as she clutched her book, desperately hoping that her small efforts would be enough to save those she cared for. Andy didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, swearing on his word that he would have her back no matter what the future held. Touched by his sudden intensity, Arya teased him about his past antics, warning him not to pull any more runaway groom stunts on her. The comment sent a fierce blush creeping up Andy's neck, his voice cracking as he insisted that the last time had been a complete accident. Their playful bickering was interrupted by the arrival of the palace guards, who brought news that seemed almost too good to be true. The Emperor had issued an official order. The old librarian was to be released immediately. Arya's eyes widened in pure, unadulterated joy, her previous despair vanishing like mist in the morning sun. In her excitement, she accidentally let her book slip from her fingers as she realized her prayers had been answered. Without a second thought, she threw her arms around Andy, her laughter ringing out as she celebrated the miraculous news. The boy froze, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stood paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming warmth of her embrace. Soon after, the library felt alive again, the shelves of ancient tomes welcoming back their rightful keeper. The old man returned to his post, his silver hair catching the light, as he resumed the work he loved so dearly. Arya's small shoes clicked softly on the floor as she approached the threshold, hesitant to break the peaceful silence. She watched him from the shadows, her heart full but her soul still heavy with the burden of her identity. She saw the weary but content expression on the old man's face, a sight that brought a bittersweet pang to her chest. She couldn't even bring herself to say a proper hello, merely watching his retreating back as he moved through the aisles. Standing on the steps, she whispered a silent wish for him to take care of himself, her small figure looking lonely against the grand architecture. As she stepped out into the golden light of the garden, her thoughts turned bitter, remembering the cold-blooded nature of the man who ruled them all. To her, Cyrus was a monster who would sacrifice his own blood for the sake of the crown, a tyrant who cared more for royal secrets than human lives. She felt small and powerless against such a formidable force, until a sudden rustle in the trees broke her train of thought. Andy dropped down from the branches like a playful kitten, his bubbly energy a startling contrast to the brooding prince she usually knew. Arya looked at him, confused by his sudden 180-degree turn in personality, finding him almost unrecognizable from his usual snarky self. She felt a desperate urge to pour out her heart to him, to scream about injustices of the queen's treatment, but the secret of her birth held her tongue. She couldn't risk blowing her cover, her hand clenching the fabric of her dress in a tight, nervous grip. Instead, she masked her pain behind a story of a terrifying dream, claiming she was worried about the queen's safety in the Tower of God. Andy's eyes lit up with a strange confidence as he told her he'd easily check on the queen himself. Because of his unique training, he was one of the few people in the entire world who could enter that sacred, forbidden site. Arya's breath hitched, her hands flying to grasp his in disbelief as she realized there was hope after all. He promised he wasn't joking, confirming that the Emperor himself had ordered his training there, a secret known to almost no one. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Arya felt like she could breathe, a radiant smile breaking across her face as she thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Andy turned away, his cheeks flushed a deep crimson as he tried to hide the effect her gratitude had on him. Arya worried for a moment that she was being pathetic, a random nobody acting all concerned about a queen she supposedly didn't even know. But Andy simply looked at her with a tender, almost reverent gaze, telling her that her compassion was what made her special. In a voice so low it was barely a whisper, he murmured that one day she would be a magnificent empress, leaving Arya blinking in confusion as he quickly denied ever saying a word. The sun bathed the spires of the royal elementary in a deceptive warmth, casting long shadows across the halls where the future of the empire was forged. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the classroom, Arya sat with her chin resting on her palm, her gaze drifting toward the window as her heart whispered a single, desperate question. Would Andy truly get to see their mother again? The air around her hummed with the chatter of other students, their voices rising as they discussed the legendary memory palace trick that had become the talk of the academy. Suddenly, a group of girls approached her, their movements hesitant yet filled with a longing to be part of her inner circle. One girl, her face did with freckles and her hands clasped tightly against chest, sheepishly asked if they might sit in on her study session. Arya's emerald eyes flickered with a hidden calculation before she offered a smile that was as sweet as honey and twice as dangerous, welcoming them with a cheerful ease that masked her true intentions. The girls beamed, their faces lighting up with pure, unadulterated gratitude, completely unaware of the complex mind hidden behind that innocent facade. However, the lighthearted atmosphere shifted the moment a new figure appeared in the doorway: Diane, the first princess, whose very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Diane's gaze was sharp, a silent judgment that settled heavily on Arya as she stood there, a statuesque beauty draped in the authority of her rank. The tension was broken by the arrival of Prince Lucian, who marched in with a scowl that spoke of 1,000 grievances, his small fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't help but complain about the suffocating pressure of their father, that academic freak who insisted on checking every single line of his homework every 5 minutes. Beside him, Belia watched with a gaze that burned with a purple fire, her lips curling in a silent sneer at the display of weakness. Meanwhile, in the heart of the royal palace, the atmosphere was far colder. The emperor sat upon his gilded chair, his handsome features frozen in a mask of indifference as he flipped through the latest academic reports. When he learned that the fourth princess had slipped to 5th place, his expression didn't change, yet the air in the room grew thin with a murderous aura. He inquired about Lucian, his voice low rumble that sent shivers down the spine of his advisor. The news was grim. The boy was struggling, his grades a testament to a mind that refused to bend to the royal standard. A vein throbbed in the emperor's temple as his eyes narrowed into slits of emerald ice. With a sudden, violent movement, he slammed the report onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent library. He wondered how a child of his could be such a pathetic excuse for a prince a brainless loser who allowed himself to be outshone by mere girls. In his own palace, Lucian was a mess of tears and trembling hands, forced to study until his eyes burned while the shadows of the maids flickered in the candlelight, their own hearts breaking for the young master. The emperor stood tall, his cape billowing behind him like a dark omen, as he looked down at his son not with love, but with the disgust one might feel for a broken tool. He recalled the prophecy of the court sage, the promise that this child would elevate the kingdom, yet all he saw now was a failure. To him, human children were little more than senseless animals, unbearable creatures that only brought disappointment. And yet, a flicker of a memory crossed his mind, a vision of a small, golden-haired girl who had once stood for him with sparkling eyes, boldly claiming she knew the digits of pi and wanted to become a mage. He paused, his hand hovering over the jeweled brooch at his chest as he wondered if there was more to Arya than the mediocre scores she presented to the world. Outside, as he walked through the manicured gardens, he listened to his knight mention that Arya had been hitting the books lately, perhaps in a desperate attempt to win his favor so she could visit her brother at military training. The knight chuckled, calling her a sweetheart, but the emperor's face remained a stone wall. He decided then and there that he would not go to see her. He had no time for those who did not meet his expectations. Far away in Diane's palace, the first princess was busy dismantling Arya's carefully constructed lies. She lay back, watching the younger girl with an intensity that made Arya's skin crawl. Diane wasn't fooled by the innocent act. She had seen the test papers and knew that Arya was intentionally tanking her scores to remain in the middle of the pack. She questioned why Arya would spill her secret so easily, her voice dripping with a suspicion that was impossible to ignore. Arya tried to weaponize her cuteness, chirping about how everyone should level up together for the sake of the kingdom. But Diane only smirked. She was curious, truly curious, about how Arya managed to nail those exact scores every single time. The interrogation was interrupted by Belia, who stormed into the room with a huff of indignation, her pride still stinging from a previous encounter in magic class. She refused to waste her time with a nobody like Arya and vanished as quickly as she had appeared, leaving a trail of irritation in her wake. Diane laughed, finding the little princess more entertaining than any court jester. As they walked together later, the air filled with the scent of blooming wisteria. Arya looked up at Diane and wondered what rank she might achieve if she actually tried. But her heart sank when they spotted their father in the distance, his strong arms lifting another child into the air with a rare display of affection. Arya's shoulders slumped as she confessed her fear that the emperor was pissed at her, that he wouldn't even look at her anymore because of her recent failure. Diane looked down at her, her expression unreadable as she offered a piece of cold, hard truth. Their father might not be fond of girls, but he hated failures even more. The air in the royal garden was thick with the scent of wisteria and the bitter taste of failure as the young girl stared at empty palms, unable to conjure even the smallest spark of magic. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird under the suffocating pressure of the emperor's gaze. A man whose presence was as cold and unforgiving as a winter tomb. Beside her, the woman who should have been her support could only offer hollow words of encouragement, though her own eyes betraying dark resentment toward her own bloodline for producing such a disappointment. Why was this child so useless, she wondered, her smile not reaching her eyes as she forced a mask of maternal concern. The emperor's expression remained a mask of stone, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade as he labeled them complete failures, his disappointment heavy enough to crush the spirit of any ordinary child. Poor Grace dissolved into a puddle of tears, her small frame trembling with a sob that echoed through the pillars, yet the tyrant showed no mercy, announcing that he would personally oversee their testing the following week. As he turned his back on their desperation, a flicker of a memory crossed his mind, a different girl, one with hair like spun gold and eyes that held a fire he couldn't quite forget. That memory haunted his emerald eyes, a ghost of a past that seemed more real than the crying child behind him. Soon, the scene shifted to the hallowed, intimidating halls of the Royal Academy where the true trial was to begin with the most grueling of subjects, mathematics. While the other students looked as though they were facing a firing squad, Ariana sat with a calm that bordered on arrogance, her quill dancing across the parchment with a speed that felt almost supernatural. Around her, the air was filled with the frantic scratching of pens and the silent screams of students who were completely lost in the sea of numbers. Grace was at her wit's end, her hair disheveled and her face flushed with a frantic, ugly sort of panic as she realized she knew absolutely nothing. She could only stare in a mixture of horror and jealousy at the back of Ariana's head, wondering how that girl could possibly be writing so fast. When the teacher finally called for them to put their pencils down, the tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. In the shadows of the past, a wicked plan had been hatched. A mother's voice whispered in a flashback, telling her child to turn in a blank paper because a perfect one would magically appear with her name on it. It was a gamble built on corruption, a desperate attempt to ensure no lowborn brat would ever outshine the true bloodline. But the arrival of His Majesty changed everything, his footsteps echoing like thunder as he entered the room, sending a jolt of pure shock through Ariana's system. He stood there, the sun catching the jewels on his chest, a godlike figure of absolute authority. He wasn't there to just watch, he demanded the papers be graded immediately, right there under his watchful, piercing eyes. Grace felt like she was walking toward the gallows, her hand clutching her chest as she realized their secret plot was about to be scrutinized by the most dangerous man in the Empire. The teacher's voice trembled as she began to read the results, starting with the high scores of the other royals. But the real shock was yet to come. First place went to Diane with a perfect score, but hot on her heels was Ariana with a 98, a feat that felt impossible for someone of her standing. The room fell into a stunned silence, the other students looking as though they had been slapped, their faces contorted with disbelief. Ariana just leaned back, her emerald eyes cool and collected, looking like a little queen who already knew her own worth. But the peace was shattered when Lucian jumped to his feet, his finger pointing accusingly as he screamed that there was no way she could have done it. He shrieked that she must have cheated, his face twisted in a mask of petty rage. Ariana didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her voice ringing out with a sharp, icy clarity as she asked what gave him the right to slander her name. He argued that the final question was far beyond their curriculum, a trap designed to catch anyone who hadn't seen the answers beforehand. The Emperor watched this play out, his gaze unreadable, but heavy with a murderous aura that made the very air feel thin. Unintimidated, Ariana threw down a gauntlet of her own, offering to solve the impossible problem right then and there to prove her honesty. A ghost of a smile touched the Emperor's lips as he challenged her to try, his curiosity finally piqued by this audacious little creature. She waved away the offer of scrap paper, her confidence so radiant it was almost blinding, claiming she could do all the complex calculations entirely in her head. A small, triumphant smile played her lips as she prepared to humiliate her accusers. Whispers of crazy and impossible rippled through the classroom, the other students leaning forward to witness what they assumed would be a spectacular fall from grace. But then she began to speak, her voice steady as she broke down the square root of 1,000 using logic and shortcuts that left the scholars in them breathless. She finished her explanation with a flourish, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the hunt. The silence that followed was broken only by the teacher's audible gasp of realization that the child was absolutely correct. The teacher clapped her hands in genuine delight, her face glowing with admiration for a genius she had never expected to find in such a young girl. Even the other students couldn't help but look at her with a new, fearful respect, while Ariana turned to the Emperor, her gaze steady as she asked if her innocence was finally proven. He beckoned her closer, his voice low and dangerous as he tested her, asking what she called him, to which she replied with a simple, soft father. He threw one more curveball at her, demanding the square root of 2,000 on the spot. Without a second of hesitation, she began to explain the mental pathways she used, her intelligence shining through every word. She walked him through the numbers with a playful, brilliant smile, showing off the mental shortcuts that made her a prodigy. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he asked where on earth she had learned such things. She shrugged it off as simple tricks, her humbleness only making her more captivating. He teased her then, his voice losing some of its edge as he accused her of cheating by using such clever shortcuts. But she insisted she studied properly when it actually mattered. The Emperor looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, the icy wall around his heart seemed to crack. Ariana watched him, her breath hitching as he reached out, his large hand moving toward her. Instead of a blow or a scolding, he confessed that he loved her quick wit, a rare compliment that felt like a gift from a god. Before she could react, he swept her up into his arms, pulling her into a doting embrace that left the entire room, and Ariana herself in a state of absolute, stunned silence. In that moment, the terrifying tyrant had become something else entirely, a father who was finally truly proud. The air in the classroom was thick with anticipation as the results were announced, declaring Princess Ariana's brilliance was beyond measure. Her second place finished a testament to a mind that worked with lethal speed. Beside her, the young prince's face flushed a deep crimson, his pride stung as he shot a look of pure, unadulterated frustration her way. He was practically vibrating with indignation, his internal monologue screaming that he would find a way to get back at her for this public humiliation. But the announcements continued, crowning Clara in third place with a solid 90 points. The girl's face lit up with pure joy, her hand shooting into the air as she basked in the rare warmth of success. Even the Emperor, a man usually carved from ice and shadow, looked down with a softening gaze, acknowledging Ariana's selfless nature in turning a mediocre student into a top scholar. He wondered how many more surprises this daughter of his was hiding behind her innocent facade, as he promised a reward to each of the top 3 students. Diane was the first to speak, her voice trembling with a daughter's longing as she requested a simple lunch with her father. Just the 2 of them. The Emperor's sharp features softened ever so slightly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as he granted the wish for that very day. Diane's heart soared, her expression a mix of triumph and relief as she accepted the invitation. Turning his piercing gaze to the others, the Emperor's presence felt like a suffocating pressure, yet Clara found the courage to ask for access to the royal library, her hunger for knowledge outweighing her fear. Ariana, ever the strategist, decided to hold her wish for another time, receiving a curt nod of approval from the sovereign. The library request was granted with a wave of a hand, leaving the classroom in a state of stunned silence at the Emperor's uncharacteristic indulgence. However, the festive mood shattered when the instructor pulled out a nameless exam, the handwriting betraying its owner as Princess Grace. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the score was revealed, a pathetic 24 points, with over half the paper left blank. The Emperor's expression darkened instantly, a murderous aura radiating from him as he stared at the wretched girl. Grace felt her soul wither under that cold, disappointed stare, her hands trembling as she tried to stammer out an excuse about sudden cramps and missed time. But the Emperor's voice was like a whip, his skepticism cutting through her lies with a single devastating question. He warned her with a chilling finality that she had better remember her promise to improve, his eyes promising a fate worse than the cold palace if she failed again. Without another word, he turned his back on her, leading Diane away for their promised meal, the sound of his boots echoing like a death knell. Grace stood frozen, the weight of her father's disdain pressing down on her as the world seemed to move on without her. The whispers began immediately, other students sneering that she was now worth even less than the bastard girl she so despised. Consumed by a toxic mix of shame and rage, Grace turned her fury toward Ariana, screaming that this was all her fault, her face twisted in a mask of hatred. Ariana could only sigh at the predictable outburst, watching as Grace fled the room in a fit of hysterical tears. Even the other noble children showed no mercy, calling Grace an incompetent moron while grudgingly admitting that Ariana was at least tolerable to look at. They wondered if they were finally starting to respect strength, just as the legendary Cyrus did. The scene shifted to the opulence of the royal palace, where the sounds of Grace's sobbing filled the gilded halls. She threw herself into her mother's arms, wailing that her father no longer loved her and begging for a way to destroy her rival. The mother's eyes glinted with a sinister light, a cruel smile curling her lips as she whispered that magic class was a dangerous place where accidents happened all the time. As the new day dawned, the students gathered for magic class, the air buzzing with a nervous energy. Professor Eric's reputation for being notoriously strict preceded him, making the students whisper in hushed, anxious tones. Ariana's friend tried to bolster her spirits, telling her to trust her training and nail the incantation. Yet, across the room, Grace sat in a dark trance, her face pale and her eyes fixed on some invisible point of malice. She replayed her mother's words like a mantra, a dark promise of revenge fueling her resolve. Her mother had already strings, ensuring the professor would play his part in the upcoming tragedy. The darkness in Grace's heart was reflected in the cold, calculating look she gave her surroundings, her thirst for vengeance overriding any sense of morality. She snapped at a nearby girl to get her tea, her voice dripping with an arrogance born of desperation. Her eyes were like violet embers, burning with a silent command that brooked no refusal. Suddenly, a new presence entered the room, a young man of such statuesque beauty and poise that the entire class fell into a stunned hush. This was Muriel, the legendary protégé of Dr. David, whose magic skills were rumored to be on a godlike level. Professor Eric seemed momentarily unsettled by the extra assistant, but he quickly masked it, his mind already calculating how to proceed with the mother's dark favor. He decided to let Muriel lead the demonstration, his eyes glinting with a hidden agenda. Muriel stepped forward, his presence commanding the room as he invited the students to address him simply. The girls in the back rows began to swoon, whispering about his gorgeous features and how lucky they would be to study under him. Claps erupted as he stood before them, a picture of perfection and power. But Muriel's eyes were only for one person. He locked gazes with Ariana, a subtle understanding coming between them as she silently mouthed his name. Her friends were nearly hyperventilating, demanding to know how she could possibly be hiding a brother this hot and talented. One of them practically short-circuited at the sight of him, her face a mask of comedic shock. The professor slammed his hand down on the desk, the sound like a thunderclap that demanded immediate order. He began the lecture on the raw elements of magic and the unlimited power they could unleash through various combinations. To gauge this power, he presented a magic meter, a complex device designed to measure the strength of any spell cast upon it. He invited Muriel to give the class a demonstration, a challenge the young man accepted with a calm, effortless grace. Without even the hint of a chant, Muriel conjured a lethal ice blade, the shards of frozen mana shimmering with a terrifying beauty. The students watched in awe, realizing that he was truly on a whole other level of mastery. With a single, powerful motion, the ice blade struck the meter with a deafening bang, sending a shockwave through the room that left everyone breathless. The air was suddenly shattered by a panicked cry to watch out as a violent surge of magic erupted, turning a peaceful classroom into a scene of absolute devastation. What was supposed to be a foolproof demonstration became a nightmare as the magic department's meters blew apart, sending children flying through the air amidst a suffocating pressure of dust and light. Amidst the chaos, Professor Eric's face twisted with a feigned concern, though internally he knew this was his perfect shot to strike. He barked orders for everyone to follow his voice to the exit, masking his murderous intent under the guise of an orderly evacuation. He tasked the others with leading the students away, insisting that he would stay behind to care for the injured. who lay unconscious on the cold floor. The young Princess Arya watched with wide, trembling eyes as her classmates were ushered out, leaving her alone with the man she trusted. She desperately offered to help, her innocent heart unaware of the viper lurking right in front of her. Eric's voice was smooth as silk as he told her she was far too young, instructing her to stay by his side while the others left. As the room grew silent and the dust settled, the professor's mask finally slipped, replaced by a gaze so cold it could freeze the soul. He mocked her worry for her friend, his voice dripping with a newfound malice that sent a chill down Arya's spine. Seemed to stop when he leaned in and whispered that she was going to die right here. Before she could even scream, his hand clamped around her throat, cutting off her air and leaving her gasping in a state of sheer terror. He sneered at her, revealing that he knew all about her secret inquiries and her connections to Baron Ware. Every word was a dagger as he implied that he was acting on behalf of His Majesty, leaving Arya to wonder if her own father truly wanted her dead. The realization was more suffocating than his grip. She had been such a fool to think she was safe within these royal walls. She struggled against him, her small hands clawing at his iron grip as the light began to fade from her eyes. Meanwhile, outside the school, King Cyrus had felt a strange pull toward the classroom, his feet moving of their own accord toward the daughter he claimed not to care for. He stood with his aide, wondering why he had even bothered to come, until a thunderous boom shook the very foundations of the building. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the explosion came from Arya's classroom. A sudden, protective fury ignited within him, and he didn't hesitate for a second before rushing toward the source of the noise. Back in the smoke-filled room, Arya felt her life slipping away, her mind racing with the bitter regret of letting her guard down. She refused to go out like this, a mere pawn to be discarded by the crown. With a final, desperate surge of will, summoned a power that defagic, a magnificent fire phoenix that erupted from her very soul without a single incantation. The legendary bird shrieked, its flames lashing out and setting the traitorous professor's hair ablaze. Eric screamed in agony and shock, unable to comprehend how a mere child could wield such primordial magic. The phoenix didn't stop there, absorbing the unstable magic in the air until it reached a breaking point, causing a second, blinding explosion. Arya used the last of her strength to shield Clara from the blast, her voice cracking as she screamed for help, desperate to expose the murderer. But Eric wasn't finished. Driven by a maddening rage, he unleashed high-level magic, conjuring electrothorns to paralyze the girl who had humiliated him. Arya felt the cold bite of the vines as they wrapped around her, pinning her to the ground in a state of total helplessness. Just as he prepared to deliver the final blow, a statuesque figure appeared through the smoke, a hand of iron catching the thorns mid-air. It was the king, his expression a mask of lethal calm as he crushed the magical construct with his bare hands. The resulting magical backlash sent Eric reeling, blood spraying from his lips as his own power turned against him. Cyrus stood over his daughter, his presence radiating an intimidating aura that silenced the room. Arya looked up at him, her eyes clouded with trauma and suspicion. Even as his aide moved to stabilize the room's elements, the princess's mind was still trapped in the horror of the moment. As her father reached out to hold her, she recoiled in terror, her voice a fragile whisper as she begged him to stay away, convinced that he was the one who had sent her executioner. The king's face paled, a flicker of genuine hurt crossing his features before he called for the doctor. Dr. David quickly assessed her, noting that her wound was superficial and she had simply fainted from magic depletion. Cyrus held her close, a rare softness in his gaze as he thanked the gods for her safety. But the moment of peace was short-lived. When he demanded the assassin be brought justice, he was informed that the professor had already swallowed poison. The king's eyes burned with a cold, vengeful fire as he ordered his men to dig into the conspiracy, promising that no one involved would escape his wrath. The moon hung heavy over the silent, imposing structure known as the Tower of God, its pale light washing over the cold stone walls. Inside, the atmosphere was just as chillingly focused as a young boy pored over his books with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His peaceful solitude was soon shattered by a companion who couldn't help but mock his overachieving nature, teasing that he was providing far too much ammunition for their teacher to roast everyone else. The newcomer leaned in with a mischievous glint in his eyes, offering a tempting deal to skip class in exchange for a favor during the next magic exam. But the studious youth wasn't so easily swayed, flatly rejecting the scandalous proposal without a second thought. The mood shifted instantly when the name of his fiancée was dropped, the mention of her causing a flicker of genuine alarm to cross his face. When he learned she had been injured, his heart skipped a beat, the news hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Panic surged through his veins as he processed the shock, his protective instincts screaming at him to move. He bolted from his seat, the urgency of the situation overriding every rule and responsibility he held dear. With a frantic swish of his cape, he disappeared into the night, desperate to reach her side. His friend called out a final warning to make up a convincing excuse for Nicholas, but the boy was already gone, consumed by worry, elsewhere in the depths of a suffocating nightmare. A young girl named Arya found herself fleeing through a grand, empty hall, her desperate cries for help echoing against the walls. A cold, spectral hand reached out from the darkness, yanking her back with terrifying strength. A man with a piercing, murderous aura loomed over her, his voice a low hiss as he questioned why she was secretly corresponding with the queen. He looked down at her with a gaze void of mercy, declaring that she was the princess who should have died years ago, her own terrified reflection shimmering in her wide, green eyes. The world blurred into a cacophony of shadows and light as the dream began to fracture. Arya bolted upright in bed, her chest heaving and cold sweat matting her hair as the horrors of the vision lingered. She looked around the opulent chamber, her mind reeling as she realized she was back in her palace bedroom. The silence of the room was heavy, her confusion mounting as she looked back at her surroundings. Just as she began to wonder how she had returned, she caught her profile in a mirror, her skin pale and clammy. A shadow flickered against the window, sending a fresh jolt of fear through her heart. Was it an assassin sent by Cyrus to finish the job? She clutched the sheets, her eyes fixed on the glass until the silhouette revealed itself to be a familiar face. It was Andy, climbing through the window with a bright, sun-drenched smile that seemed to banish the lingering darkness of her dream. His eyes softened with immediate concern as he looked at her, his gaze searching hers for any sign of pain. He demanded to know what had happened and how she had ended up with such an injury. Arya hesitated, looking at his worried expression and wondering if she should trust him with the dangerous truth. Ultimately, she decided to shield him, fearing that involving him in her mess would only lead to his ruin. She offered a half-hearted lie about a magic class mishap, even sealing it with a playful pinky promise to ease his mind. When she questioned why he was ditching his own lessons, she worried Nicholas might notice his absence. He boasted with a cheeky grin that he had Nicholas wrapped around his little finger. Little did she know, he was keeping a secret of his own that his twin Elvin was currently covering for his absence. She urged him to leave before he was caught and punished, her voice soft but firm. Andy reached out to pat her hand, a gesture of affection that she quickly brushed off as too touchy-feely, though her heart fluttered nonetheless. He turned to leave, his face flushing a deep crimson as he prepared to exit the way he came. Stopping at the window, he looked back one last time, his expression turning uncharacteristically serious. He told her that she was his queen, and she mattered more than some training, leaving her completely stunned. The romantic moment was abruptly cut short by a sharp knock on the door, signaling the arrival of Hampton. Arya scrambled to Gandhi out, her pulse racing as she warned him he'd be toast if he were discovered. He leaped down into the night just as she composed herself, the sheer absurdity of the situation feeling like something out of a forbidden romance novel. She took a deep breath, smoothing her nightgown and trying to keep her composure. Rubbing her eyes to look appropriately sleepy, she greeted the guard. But the news he brought was far from routine. The mastermind behind the attack had been caught, and the Emperor demanded her presence immediately. As she was led toward the throne room, her mind raced with the shocking revelation that Lady Rose was the culprit. The Emperor sat upon his throne, his presence radiating a suffocating pressure as he looked down at the accused woman. Rose fell to her knees, her voice trembling with false indignation as she claimed she was being framed by the conniving little princess. She begged him not to be fooled by Arya's innocent act, but the shadow of her defeat loomed large as the evidence was presented. As they walked through the towering, ornate corridors, the night's revelation felt like a bucket of ice water, so it was Lady Rose all along, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, just because Princess Grace felt overshadowed. Ariana looked up at the knight, her green eyes wide as he confirmed that the concubine had indeed orchestrated the entire plot to eliminate her. Her mind raced, connecting the dots back to the queen and the mysterious letters from Weir, realizing that the web of palace intrigue was far deeper and more suffocating than she ever imagined. If the Emperor truly wanted her dead, he wouldn't have used such a messy, theatrical method. He had 1,000 cleaner ways to dispose of a child. The realization that she was caught in the middle of petty princess drama rather than a high-stakes political execution made her want to scream she was only 12, for heaven's sake, and this mess was getting far too complicated. She let out a weary huff, her chibi-like frustration hidden behind a mask of youthful innocence as the knight tried to reassure her that his majesty would be fair. They finally reached the grand audience chamber, where the air was thick with tension and the scent of impending doom. Ariana decided then and there to play the part of the quiet, observant victim, watching as the doors groaned open to reveal the chaos within. Lady Rose was already there, her face a mask of pale terror and desperate rage as she shrieked that the little brat was setting her up. But the moment the tyrant on the throne turned his gaze toward Ariana, the murderous aura in the room shifted into something unexpectedly warm. Cyrus, the golden-haired emperor, reached out a hand that had likely spilled oceans of blood, beckoning her to come closer so she could decide the fate of the woman who tried to kill her. Ariana steeled herself, meeting his gaze with a maturity that didn't belong to a child, declaring she was ready to face whatever came next. Cyrus offered a rare, chillingly satisfied smile, his eyes glinting with a dark pride at her display of spine. Lady Rose, consumed by a toxic cocktail of jealousy and desperation, realized in that moment that she and Grace were losing everything to this conniving little witch. Driven to madness, The concubine lunged across the floor, her fingers clawing like talons as she screamed for the girl to drop dead. In a flash of crimson silk and lethal speed, Cyrus snatched Ariana into his protective embrace while the knight slammed the wretched woman into the carpet with a bone-jarring thud. Even pinned to the ground, Rose continued to thrash and spit venom, her words a frantic blur of insults directed at the child in the Emperor's arms. The air suddenly crackled with a terrifying red mana as Cyrus's patience finally snapped, his eyes glowing with the promise of a slow, agonizing end. A sickening, metallic sound echoed through the silent hall as the tyrant took his retribution, leaving Rose staring in mute, bloody horror at the piece of herself she would never get back. Ariana's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the scene, the sheer brutality of her father finally sinking in. Cyrus merely brushed it off, deciding that a child shouldn't have to worry about the messy details of making someone truly suffer. He would handle the torture personally to ensure no mercy was shown. He looked down at her then, his expression shifting back to that of a doting, gentle father as he cupped her face. With a casual wave of his hand, he sentenced Lady Rose to beheading and her entire bloodline to the living hell of the northern border slave camps. As for Princess Grace, she was condemned to rot in the Tower of God, never to see the light of day again, a fate that left her weeping in broken silence. As the guards dragged the trash away, the chamber returned to a hauntingly quiet peace. Cyrus leaned in, his voice a low purr as he asked if his little Ariana was satisfied with the blood he had shed for her. The shock left her frozen, her breath hitching as the statuesque leaned even closer, wondering if the display of force had been too much for his delicate daughter. She couldn't find the words, her mind spinning at the sheer scale of the revenge he had exacted on her behalf. Before she knew it, she was being hoisted up and sat unceremoniously on the Emperor's lap right there on the throne. The knight watched the scene with a mix of awe and sheer confusion, wondering if the bloodthirsty tyrant had actually been replaced by a doting, overprotective dad. Cyrus shamelessly squished her cheek, teasing her about whether she was truly terrified of the monster who had just protected her. It was a sight that would have made any other royal faint, the most feared man in the Empire acting like a common, smitten parent. The knight's internal monologue raced as he realized any other spoiled royal would have faced the Emperor's wrath for such behavior. But with Ariana, he was actually being a dad. Ariana looked at him, realizing that while the world saw a monster, she saw a man who would burn the heavens down to keep her safe. She remembered the tales of his ruthless rise to power, the images him standing amidst flames and swords to keep the people in line. He was a true tyrant, a man who believed power without force was nothing but empty words. But when she smiled back at him, all that darkness seemed to fade into the background. He whispered that she was his daughter, regardless of blood, while Ariana privately chuckled at the irony. If only he knew she actually was his true flesh and blood. That night, as the moon hung high over the silent palace, the echoes of the purge still lingered in the air. In a secluded study, a mysterious man listened as his subordinate confirmed that every trace of their involvement in the Lady Rose plot had been scrubbed clean. He toyed with the golden locket, his eyes cold as he calculated the threat Ariana posed to his own ambitions. To him, the girl was a shadow crawling over his future, a variable that needed to be cooled before she became too powerful. He looked at the portrait of his own son, his gaze hardening with a father's ruthless determination. He flashed a deceptive, charming smile, wondering if anyone truly on the lengths a father would go to for his child's inheritance. With Ariana around, his boy would always be in her shadow, and he couldn't allow his son to live in the background of the royal palace. Meanwhile, in the sun-drenched gardens, the terrifying Emperor was busy hand-feeding cookies to a very pampered Ariana. It was a scene of pure, domestic bliss that felt almost absurd given the blood spilled the day before. From behind the bushes, a young boy watched with a pout, heart filled with a childish, burning jealousy that his father ever treated him with such sweetness. He grumbled to his attendant, refusing to join them even when suggested. He shouted back in frustration, declaring it wasn't about whether she cared or not. He adjusted his collar, his eyes flashing with a mix of rivalry and resentment, as he vowed to one day step out of the girl's overwhelming shadow, tired of her genius make him look brain dead. The golden afternoon sun bathed the royal gazebo in a deceptive warmth, yet the air remained thick with the lingering scent of iron and fear. Ariana desperately stuffed her face with sweets, hoping the sugar would drown out the horrific memories of the gore she had just witnessed. Across the table, the tyrant sat like a statuesque god of war, his piercing gaze tracking her every move with a coldness that made her skin crawl. She had just survived the scare of her life, and now she was expected to simply enjoy tea with the man who held her very soul in his hands. When the silence became too heavy, she snapped that a measly tea party couldn't possibly make up for the trauma she'd endured, only to freeze in terror a second later. Had she really just spoken to the Emperor in such a way? Her heart hammered against her ribs as she awaited a death sentence, certain she had finally pushed the tyrant too far. But instead of a blade, she felt strong arms wrap around her as he lifted her small frame with unexpected care. The suffocating pressure vanished, replaced a promise that sent shivers down her spine. As long as he was around, no one would ever dare lay a finger on Hen. It was a staggering revelation for the girl who had already written him off as a heartless monster. Could it be that this man, feared by the entire empire, was actually capable of comforting a child like a real father? From the shadows of the garden, a pair of eyes burned with a different kind of fire. Crown Prince Willis watched the scene with a heart twisted by bitter jealousy, unable to believe the spell this interloper had cast over their father. The king had never looked at his own son with softness, and the sight was a jagged pill to swallow. Ariana felt the weight of those hidden stares, her instincts screaming that they weren't alone. Cyrus didn't even need to turn his head to acknowledge the intruders, mocking the scared little runts, hiding in the bushes with a voice like velvet-covered steel. Willis could only tremble as he watched his father carry the girl away, his own position in the palace suddenly feeling precarious and cold. Even as his loyal servant tried to comfort him by pointing out how unprecedented this affection was, Willis snapped, refusing to let anyone badmouth the father he so desperately wanted to impress. He would maintain his dignity, docking the man's pay for his insolence. But the seed of competition was firmly planted. He wouldn't use dirty tricks to get rid of Ariana. He would win back his father's favor fair and square. Meanwhile, Ariana found herself being led into the most sacred part of the palace, the emperor's own bedchamber. Her jaw dropped when he casually informed her that since he hadn't found a suitable guardian, she would simply be crashing at his place for the foreseeable future. It was a move that defied every royal precedent, a shocking display of doting that left her speechless. When she tried to protest her lowly status, he silenced her with 3 simple words: she was his daughter, and his mind was made up. He dismissed her to rest, leaving her to be pampered by a flock of maids who looked at her with sparkling, adoring eyes. As they changed her into a silk nightgown, Ariana realized that while Cyrus was undeniably controlling, he was also the most powerful shield she could ever ask for. He immediately tasked his most trusted guard with her security, sensing that the danger surrounding her was far from over. Alone in her new, opulent quarters, Ariana's mind whirled with schemes. She couldn't just be an ungrateful brat after he had bent over backwards for her. She needed to return the favor with a gift, but when she asked the maids about the emperor's tastes, they practically turned pale with fright. The tyrant's reputation was so terrifying that no one dared to even guess what he might like. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a calming tonic sent straight from the palace kitchen on his orders. She took a hopeful sip of the seaweed soup, only to nearly choke as the foul liquid hit her tongue. It was like drinking liquid death, a concoction so vile she wondered if it was a prank or a genuine attempt at health. But as the bitterness faded, a mischievous spark lit up her emerald eyes. She knew exactly what kind of surprise she was going to cook up for her terrifying new father. In the ethereal elven kingdom, magic wasn't just a tool. It was the very breath of the people, a national pastime that rendered even the basic need for food obsolete. To reach such a level of mastery meant one could transcend mortal hunger, leaving regular meals as nothing more than decorative props for social gatherings. Because taste was a secondary concern for most, the culinary arts had withered into a forgotten relic, a mere eye candy for the elite. This disdain for the physical act of eating was championed by none other than King Cyrus himself, a man who viewed mortal food as something beneath his divine station. To the cold and statuesque king, the very act of consuming food was absolutely revolting, an attitude that trickled down through every corridor of the palace. Consequently, the food served within these golden walls was straight-up trash, so wretched that even a tonic loaded with seaweed and MSG was enough to make one's stomach turn in protest. But little Arya wasn't about to let this culinary disaster stand. She would flip this tragedy into a golden opportunity, whipping up a homemade soup to express her heartfelt gratitude to the man who had saved her. Standing on a small stool to reach the towering kitchen counters, she looked like a tiny, determined chef ready to wage war against the palace's bland traditions. With a focused gaze, she prepared to toss the seaweed into the pot, her small hands moving with a purpose that left the staff breathless. The palace maids were in a complete state of panic, their faces pale as they begged Her Highness not to dirty her royal hands with such common labor. Yet Arya wouldn't be deterred, directing them with the authority of a seasoned master as the water began to boil. News of the princess taking over the main kitchen spread through the palace like wildfire, leaving everyone in a state of utter disbelief. Even Prince Lucian, the king's only son, heard the rumors while walking through the grand halls, his expression darkening with every step. Spies lingered at the kitchen doors, unable to fathom what kind of strange concoction the little girl was brewing amidst the clouds of steam. Lucian couldn't help but scoff, convinced that this nothing more than a pathetic attempt at brown-nosing that would surely end in disaster. He was practically vibrating with malicious glee, eager to head to the dining hall just to witness her inevitable crash and burn. He strode toward the dining area, his heart full of resentment as he prepared for the spectacle. Inside the lavish dining hall, Arya stood before the intimidating king, looking like a small doll against the backdrop of royal opulence. With a hopeful heart, she placed the bowl of seaweed soup before him, her emerald eyes searching his face for even a flicker of warmth. She softly explained that she had racked her brain to find a way to repay his kindness, stumbling upon a cooking technique in a dusty old book. Lucian watched from the shadows of the hallway, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he waited for his father to tear her apart for such an audacity. He remembered how he had been scolded for less, and he was certain the king would see right through her childish act. Cyrus stared at the simple dish, his voice cold as he reminded her that magic training demanded full concentration, and she shouldn't waste her energy on something as useless as cooking. The atmosphere in the room turned suffocatingly heavy, the king's pressure bearing down on the small girl as he voiced his disapproval. Arya didn't flinch. Instead, she lowered her head with a soft smile, agreeing that he was right. But then she looked up an expression of pure, unadulterated devotion, stating that cooking was simply a small way for a child to show their love. She had everything because of him, and the only thing she could offer in return was something made with her own 2 hands. The tyrant's gaze almost imperceptibly as he warned her to be careful not to burn herself while playing around with such things. Seizing the moment, Arya leaned in, her eyes sparkling like gems as she pleaded for him to at least take a single taste. Cyrus hesitated before finally lifting the golden spoon, the steam from the soup rising to meet his statuesque features. As the liquid touched his tongue, his eyes widened in genuine shock. He had never tasted anything so profound in his entire life. The coldness in his heart seemed to melt for a fleeting moment as he looked at her, wondering how she could have possibly created such a masterpiece. Deep down, a hidden ache surfaced. Wish that a child this gifted, this incredible, were truly his own flesh and blood. Arya beamed, her blush deepening as she prepared to reveal her secret. When he asked for the recipe, she chirped that the secret ingredient was simply the love she had poured into every single drop while thinking of him. It was a line so cheesy it could make a grown man cringe, and Cyrus knew that if he were a senile old king, he might have fallen for it completely. Yet she insisted it was her own secret magic, a weapon of cuteness used to pierce through his icy exterior. Outside, Lucian was reaching his breaking point, his face contorted in a mask of pure jealousy as he watched the girl be welcomed with open arms while he felt like garbage. A dark, resentful question burned in his mind. Which one of them was the king's real child? The drama of the palace followed Arya even to the royal elementary school, where the sun shone brightly over the grand spires of the academy. She was immediately swept into a tight hug by her friends Clara and Diane, who had been worried sick since the assassination attempt on her life. They checked her over frantically, their eyes wide with relief to see her standing there in her school uniform. Arya gave them a reassuring smile, grateful for their genuine concern after everything she had endured. News of her culinary triumph had already reached the school gates, with whispers following her about the special soup the king had supposedly loved. Arya laughed it off, explaining that she simply owed him for catching the person who tried to kill her. Diane's expression turned serious as she signaled for silence, warning Arya that someone else had tried to win the king over with food once, and it had backfired horribly. As Spotion walked past them, his small frame radiating a cold, resentful energy that sent a chill through the air. He huffed in annoyance, his gaze lingering on Arya with a grudge that was plain for all to see. Diane whispered a warning that the prince was acting like a brat because his pride was wounded. The school bell rang, cutting their conversation short as they hurried toward their lessons. But Diane wasn't finished. She leaned in to share a chilling secret. Duke Nahan, a powerful man who doted on Lucian, was the boy's real father and had been behind the baby swap all along. Arya froze, the weight of the revelation sinking in, as she realized that Duke Nahan was the true shadow lurking in the dark. If she became a threat to Lucian's position, the Duke would likely not let her live. She thanked Diane for the heads up, her mind racing with the new danger she faced. Inside the classroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension as students stared at her with suspicious glares. Arya felt exhausted, her head resting on her desk as she tried to process the looming threat. Suddenly, the door opened, and a tall figure stepped into the room. A familiar voice rang out, causing Arya's heart to skip a beat as she looked up in disbelief. Standing at the front of the class was a handsome man with golden hair and a gentle smile. He introduced himself as Muriel, their new magic studies teacher, but the look in Arya suggested that this was a reunion she never expected. The classroom was thick with the hushed whispers of students, gazes fixed on the statuesque figure at the front of the room who looked more like a god than a scholar. Arya sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the absurd reality that her own brother had become her teacher overnight. Muriel commanded the room with effortless grace, his voice smooth as silk as he explained that while magic required practical combat, one had to master the theory inside and out. Arya couldn't help but beam with sisterly pride, shamelessly weaponizing her admiration, while her classmates teased her for having such an obvious brother complex. As the school bell echoed through the halls, the students began to disperse, leaving the golden afternoon light to spill over the stone corridors. They retreated to the quiet sanctuary of the Royal Elementary back courtyard to escape the prying eyes of the student body. Sitting on a weathered bench, Arya chirped about how everyone was already obsessed with him, her eyes sparkling like gems as she praised his teaching skills. She was so hyped up that she practically glowed, declaring that when her brother shines, she shines right along with him. But a flicker of curiosity crossed her face. She wondered how he had even secured such a prestigious position in the first place. Muriel's expression softened, though a hint of gravity touched his eyes as he revealed that he owed his position to more than just his own genius. While the Academy's doctors had recognized his talent, they initially feared he was far too young to keep the rowdy students in line. That was until a summons came from the highest power in the land, leading Muriel into a room heavy with a suffocating pressure. The Emperor sat behind his desk, his presence intimidating and his gaze colder than winter snow as he questioned Muriel's relationship to the girl. In that grand, shadow-filled office, the tyrant made his intentions crystal clear, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He demanded a sacred vow that as long as Muriel was at the school, Arya would never face a single moment of danger. The Emperor leaned forward, his emerald eyes piercing through the young man as he asked for a promise to protect the child at all costs. Back in the present, Arya sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding as she realized just how much the Emperor truly cared for her. However, the warmth of the moment was shattered by a murderous aura lurking in the shadows nearby. Prince Lucian watched them from behind a tree, his face twisted of pure, unadulterated rage as he cursed the girl who had stolen his father's affection. Driven by a toxic jealousy, the young prince fled the palace grounds under the cover of night, heading toward the imposing spires of Duke Nahan's castle. He looked small and wretched in his dark cloak, trembling not from the cold, but from the bitterness consuming his soul. Duke Nahan lounged in his study, his handsome fixed in a calculative expression as he asked what could possibly be important enough to risk such a dangerous outing. Tears welled in Lucian's eyes as he confessed his agony, feeling that his father loved Arya far more than he had ever loved his own son. Nahan's gaze was sharp yet strangely inviting as he told the prince he could reveal even his darkest, ugliest thoughts without fear of judgment. The boy's lip trembled, his hands clenching into tight fists as the resentment boiled over. He couldn't stand the way rules were being bent just to shield that wretched child. In a fit of anguish, Lucian admitted his deepest desire. He wanted her gone so he'd finally be his father's favorite again. Nahan pulled the boy into a deceptive embrace, a chilling expression on his face as he promised that everything would unfold exactly as the prince wished. As the carriage carried the vengeful prince away, Nahan stood on the balcony, the moonlight catching the malicious glint in his eyes. He turned to his loyal shadow, his voice a low hiss as he prepared to set a devastating plan in motion. The duke was ready to strike at the heart of the royal family, his statuesque form radiating a cold, calculating power. He told his subordinate that he had a specific job in mind, one that would change the course of the empire. The subordinate hesitated, worried that the emperor would see through another assassination attempt after the last failure. He pointed out that Muriel and the shadow guards were watching the girl's every move, making her virtually untouchable. But Nahan only smirked, his expression void of human warmth, as he explained that he wouldn't need to get his hands dirty this time. He knew the emperor had one secret weakness, a person hidden away that no one was allowed to approach, and he intended to lead Arya right to her. Deep within the royal palace, the night air was still and heavy with secrets. Suddenly, a figure scrambled through a high window, startling Arya in her private chambers. It was Cyrus, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nerves as he invited her to commit a daring act of treason with him. He claimed there was a golden opportunity to sneak into the forbidden Tower of God and meet the queen face to face. Arya's breath hitched as he explained that a monster attack outside the capital had drawn away all the high-level clerics and mages. Cyrus produced 2 invisibility cloaks, boasting that their basic enchantments would be more than enough to slip past the remaining non-magical guards. He laid out the path through the main hall, but Arya's face paled as she thought of the catastrophic risks involved. She remembered how even mentioning the queen had landed a librarian in the dungeon, and the fear of a diplomatic nightmare between kings weighed heavily on her. Her mind drifted to her family and the peaceful life they had built, terrified that one wrong move would shatter it all. Cyrus pressed her, insisting that if they missed this chance, there would never be another one. Arya's expression hardened with a sudden, fierce resolve as she snatched the cloak, telling him she would go alone to ensure he didn't do anything stupid. She watched him disappear back through the window, her heart racing as the silence of the room closed in on her. The longing to see the woman who had fallen into such a deep depression after her brother's birth was a physical ache in her chest. She remembered the stories the head maid had whispered about the queen's isolation and the noble ladies who used to visit. With trembling hands, she pulled the shimmering fabric overhead, feeling the magic round her like a cold shroud. She slipped out of her room and approached the massive, ornate doors of the Tower of God, praying to any deity listening that she wouldn't be caught. The guards at the entrance felt a strange, sudden breeze, their eyes scanning the empty air with suspicion. One guard dismissed it as his imagination, allowing the invisible girl to slip past them into the dark, echoing stairwell. Arya moved like a ghost, her footsteps silent as she ascended toward the forbidden heights of the tower. But as she reached the top, the air suddenly grew heavy, and a voice like cracking ice cut through the darkness. The invisibility magic flickered and died, revealing her trembling form right in front of the one person who could end her life with a single word, the Emperor himself.